And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's a fantastic crowd tonight already. We definitely had some very interesting things going on behind the scenes, which I'm going to tip everyone off to. But as usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And it's already a terrific crowd with questions. What we're going to do right up front is tell you that in the second part of the program, we're going to go to questions, so make sure you ask them in all caps. We are in Dark Journalist X Series episode 69. This is Pharaohs and the Hotzone, Egyptian Mysteries and Atlantis. Now, one of the interesting things that's happening is when we get into Egypt around the Bahamas, there's a great deal of information that we've brought forward regarding this. But oddly enough, one of the foremost Egyptology experts, Dr. Carmen Bolter from the University of Calgary, who we've interviewed before, but we haven't had her on the show in about, I think it's 2 years.
Mm-hmm. It's
been a while. And she's been in Spain and conducting all of this research in Egypt and Turkey. So, interestingly enough, this week we talked, and she was in the Hotzone. She was actually filming down there, and she was coming in tonight from NASA into Florida, and we had set it up so that she's going to be joining the broadcast. She has the, we're on here with each other. She had a little delay coming through customs, and this is
what you've got to deal with when you've got a live show.
Yeah, this is the interesting way that it works coming through. But we're live here with her, so if any messages come through, we're going to be able to troubleshoot her coming on, and I do expect her to join the podcast, but we're going to launch right into it anyway. I want to say, in relation to Carmen's work, we have quite a history with Carmen. She really did the Pyramid Code for Netflix, which was fascinating. It was a 5-part episode, and it was really in-depth, a totally different look at the pyramids, what they meant to Egypt, how the mystery schools were involved, etc. And Carmen, being someone who comes from the world, of the university world of academia on one hand, but having all these psychic impressions, studying past lives and all of this kind of information, which really informs her work very differently.
Absolutely. Well, it's psychic archaeology, right?
It is, indeed. And as we found, that's a very potent form of archaeology when we consider the work of Edgar Cayce, the new emerging work of Gigi Young that we've been applying into these episodes in the show, and some of the emphasis of using all the tools available to bring forward this incredible mystery that we've had from the past. Now, one of the things that we talked about, which might seem contradictory, is these ancient mysteries of Egypt and the Pharaohs in the Hotzone. Now, as we know, and I'd like to point out the locations of these. I brought a lot of maps tonight. I went map happy at the end of printing these things out. But this is our standard map of the Hotzone. And really, we have to think about it as an area that extends from the Yucatan Peninsula over here right through western Cuba, the western tip of Cuba, which is San Antonio, Cuba. And right off that tip, of course, is where the Russian oceanographer Paulina Zelitsky found the Cuban city, which we're going to be revisiting again tonight. Some of the Bimini aspects of this map up here, and that's right off the coast of Florida, all in this Bahamas area here. That is all the Hotzone. Now, just to revisit why we call it the Hotzone, actually, I've been in touch with someone for about 2 years who was an oceanographer for a private contracting company that was mapping the ocean floor. So it's non-military personnel who got in touch with me in a very interesting way. They didn't use conventional email for it. But what they wanted to communicate to me is that some of the stuff that I was doing around Atlantis and the Bahamas was accurate in this sense, in that there's an area down there on the ocean floor, which if you are a contractor, and I imagine this extends if you're in the military, if you see these large-scale ruins that are underwater along the surface of the ocean, then on the floor of the ocean, then what happens is you have to sign something when you go in there. It's an NDA, and the NDA says you can't describe anything you've seen, nor the presence of it. You can't disclose the presence of it, etc. You can't keep the presence of it. You can't hold coordinates and all the rest of it. And what he told me is that they referred to the area as the Hotzone. Now, what's interesting is for me doing this research, when I went in and spoke to people who were familiar with the subject of this part of the ocean and other researchers, they had actually heard echoes of this or a similar name. So this hot zone is something that's familiar to people who work there under these types of conditions where they have to keep it. Now, the reason that they have to keep it secret is apparently geopolitically, and for a number of reasons. On the surface, we can see that these ruins stretch back into a much larger mystery. So we have a series now, some 16 episodes on the hot zone inside of this 70 some odd episodes of the X series. And we've had characters inside of it, like Ernest Hemingway. Last week was Charles Lindbergh, and bringing these historical factors that they were in there and they were working on these ruins in the hot zone in secret. And that some of the tensions that we see geopolitically, whether it's from Cuba, Venezuela, Honduras, these types of tensions that we see, and even some of the bizarre weather patterns we've seen in the Bahamas, could very well all be attributed to the presence of very extensive artifacts and archaeology dating back thousands of years to an advanced culture that occupied that part of the ocean, right off of the eastern coast of the United States and stretching along the Gulf of Mexico down into the Caribbean. Now, this area, is no mystery to those who are looking for Atlantis, because in the 1930s, actually originally 1926, America's sleeping prophet, Edgar Cayce, who gave some 900 readings on Atlantis, told us that Bimini was where these ruins were rising. And one of the things that I've learned in relation to what the hot zone is all about is land rising. We have to get this through our heads. Atlantis rising, land rising, a landmass rising off of the east coast of America. All of the implications that involves. And when I went deeper into it, I found there were a number of celebrities, people like John Lennon, who had bought lots in the ocean, and also people like Ernest Hemingway's brother, who had actually set up New Atlantis but that was over by Jamaica, kind of close to the hot zone. And the whole idea is that these people were predicting where this landmass was going to rise, because when it rises, it is, especially if it's in international waters, it becomes a totally new place. And so there's a number of things that they can do there. It's a sovereign country, etc. Now, a lot of people have told me, well, we hear so much about the oceans rising and all the rest of it. So I did research on this, of course. And there's a phenomena of islands rushing up through the ocean and becoming visible. And this we see in different parts of the world. It's happening in the Pacific right now. And in the case of Bimini, the research that I did suggests that there's some kind of suppressed volcanic activity down there off the coast of Bimini that may be forcing some of these this land and these ruins up. So it's not like a collective, the whole thing will rise and the ocean will retreat. It's more that however the level of the ocean, these things can move and the plates can shift and so on. The way that Cayce described it very often sounded like land would rise in some areas while it's going down in others. And we've heard a lot about earth changes. So I think that what we're going to be seeing over this decade of the 2020s is it's going to be the decade of this land rising. And I think what we associate with Atlantis, this ancient culture, will no longer, they're going to have to disclose the presence of this culture, and they won't be able to hide it as they have very successfully up to now. Also, given its presence all through the hot zone, it appears to me that some people have better access to it. The Cubans have better access. There's an intelligence officer named Egerton Sykes who lived right up until about the mid-1980s, and he did some 40-odd years of research on Atlantis and left us that research. But he was the first one to identify intelligence operations related to these older structures under the water and the reasons why that might be. Now, when we look at the work of Edgar Cayce, he suggested that information about the power stations that Atlantis had were contained there off the coast of Bimini. So this gets very exciting. This is some of what we're going to get into tonight. We have to remember that in many ways, what we studied in terms of mystery schools and secret societies letting this kind of information out over time, that the time is in the earliest 21st century. A lot of this information is coming out, and a lot of these structures that control society have to balance that out, whether it's the UFO file or whether it's the acknowledgement of Atlantis. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I have a fantastic comment from Danielle Jorgensen, who says, I saw things as an archaeology student 30 years ago, and I'm so grateful that people are finally doing the underwater work. My questions got me doomed in the field.
Yep.
All politics, no science. I never expected such vicious protectionism from an area of study that claims to want answers about our past. Quote, he who controls the past controls the future, unquote. Learned the hard way.
Oh my God. In archaeology, it's full on 1984. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. And it's interesting too, what you say, because when we had Graham up here a couple of months ago, and we did an event with him, I was speaking to him about this, and it gets brought up in that talk, which is online on the channel here. And it's very interesting because he knew a series of archaeologists who had evidence that pushed back civilization and the founding of civilization way beyond that Samaria in 4000 BC. And their careers were ruined, literally. And for Graham, he was lucky. I mean, they tried to push his career off the rails also, but he was a journalist predominantly. People forget that he had actually worked at Economist magazine. That's where he came from. He came at this in a similar way that I would, in a sense. So since he wasn't in the field, when they went after him from the archaeological side, they couldn't really ruin him. Although they applied an awful lot of pressure through groups like Sykes and all the rest of it, and try to get him disqualified from speaking at universities and, short-circuiting his lecture tour and things like that. So this woman's testimony there gives us a real hint that there's something very powerful that the ruling structure in archaeology, don't want us to know. But geopolitical forces are arrayed around the Hotzone, and that's where this really gets interesting. For anyone who's followed these episodes, we know that all the way through the Hemingways and the Lindberghs, right up through the Kennedys, there's all this intrigue relation to the work of archaeology being done in that corridor of the Hotzone between Cuba, Bimini, and the Yucatan Peninsula, and stretching down, to Belize and places like that. Let's get a little bit into this now. Edgar Cayce, when he gave these readings in relation to Bimini, he was talking about Pleiadians rising, and I think that this is important. I have to say that there is cause for us to look at his work and say that he was giving us a hint that society was going to be transformed as a result of this. And that's what's very crucial, I think, to keep in mind. The second thing that I would say in relation to Cayce is that he, on several occasions, would return to the idea that the Poseidon Temple contained this Hall of Records. And now the Hall of Records is something that the Atlanteans left, and this is an advanced group that, as the land was under cataclysm, they hid records of their history and of some of the advanced aspects of their society, according to Cayce, in three places. One in Egypt under the Sphinx right paw, and second in the Yucatan, in a temple there, off the Yucatan Peninsula in the Hotzone, and then in the sunken temple of Poseidon, which is right off of Bimini, which we've seen a trace of in the Bimini Wall. Cayce had predicted that it would rise in 68 or 69, and that's when we got it. J. Manson Valentine found it in 1968 in September. Now, Manson Valentine is very important because he was a Yale zoologist, but he, because he wasn't a gadfly or just a researcher, he was somebody who was really in the know about these things. And so for him to be this committed and, kind of risking his career to do this, and then finding ruins of Atlantis based on the Edgar Cayce readings, made him kind of an outcast, but also an outlier for what was to come. Because if you look at the subject, you've got now this incredible split in archaeology, and archaeology might be 99% lined up strong and hardcore against this idea. But there's so many ideas from people like Graham Hancock and from people like Andrew Collins that have come forward, and they've brought their research up. And so some of that archaeology has started to crack. I mean, they started questioning the date of the Sphinx as far back as the 1990s for real, because they had weather patterns on the Sphinx that were related to rain, and rain in the Nile didn't happen. It happened all the way back in 10,000 BC, so they didn't know how to explain that. So we've had those kind of very interesting intervals. Now, when I have talked to people along this line, when I think of the work of John Anthony West, who's passed on, or Robert Schoch, and I would also, of course, Graham Hancock, and who wrote Orion, the Orion Mystery, our friend there?
I cannot think of his name.
Okay.
Robert Bivol?
Bivol, yes,
Okay.
He's the other one. That's really, that is an incredible gauntlet of information and figures that I just listed off there. And they brought it up a level. That is, they brought it out of Casey's incredible seeing, and they brought some of the evidence forward. But in between there are people like Egerton Sykes, who basically no one's ever heard of. And yet they did some of the most fascinating work. Now, Sykes, I want to go into briefly, and I also want to remind you that you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are on episode X, series 69. We were originally going to have Carmen Bolter on the show. She has had some problems getting out of Nassau and into back to Florida, where she is currently. She's still having those problems, so I don't know if she's going to be able to join us tonight. They had very bad weather coming out of there. I am going to try to get her back while she's still in the United States, and I'm sure that we can work this out. But if we do miss her tonight, then we'll have a good setup tonight for when she comes on, and I'll work that out with her as soon as we're done. Yes.
Okay, Ward Weinheimer wants to know, are there other psychics than Casey who have information about Atlantis?
Yeah, actually, what's interesting is a number of psychics, great and known and not so known, have taken a crack at this. And if you read a book by David Zink called The Stones of Atlantis, which is a book that actually came out in the late 70s, now we're talking almost 40 years ago, there's a very extensive search that Zink does as an archaeologist. And he finds all kinds of interesting things in the Hotzone, although they're not calling it that there. But at a certain point, he's using these psychics to try to locate certain locations. And they're getting a lot of very interesting information. So it's not limited to Casey for sure. In the work that I've done with Gigi Young in looking at this, she's isolated things that are stunningly accurate. And I feel that if I work it out with Gigi, where she's, looking at this area, looking to find ruins in the Hotzone in relation to the Hall of Records of this lost civilization, I think we're going to get some very, very interesting clues from her psychic work. So she's the psychic that I would point to in modern times, who kind of has the best, has kind of come up with the best information recently, but certainly there's a lot of them, and getting them all working together would be the ultimate. Here's the thing. Whenever we look at information like Casey's or information about mystery schools, when we go to execute that information, we go to find out the scientific bearings that'll give us the foundation of it. It just so happens that, a lot of people would just say, well, we need this type of evidence. And it's absolutely true. You need the concrete evidence. But your methods, on the other hand, have to be different if you're going to get different types of results. And so in dealing with a part of our lost consciousness, our lost story, employing faculties that we once possessed, like psychic ability, is absolutely crucial. And so I think that this becomes a very important key point in all this. And so tonight, we're going to look at the psychic aspect of the archaeology, and we're going to look at those archaeology wars that have taken place over this hot zone. And I'm going to show what, the TKO of these stories. And I have a series of them of people who found extraordinary things, and then the stories were hushed up. The most dramatic one we've laid out is Paulina Zelitsky. Turns out there's others, and they're every bit as
I keep eyeballing that picture over there.
There's no question about it. So this is the TKO for this episode, and it is a story that came out now in 2014 about a Sphinx found offshore from the Bahamas. And these are the pictures that came out. These pictures are very interesting, and they have that ability of not being photoshopped. That much we can say right off the bat. Now, if anyone had faked this picture, yes, they could have lowered a stone structure down there and had someone take pictures of it, but there was no Photoshop involved. I had that double-checked. The picture itself is quite extraordinary, and it shows a diver there in the hot zone, and what he has is a version of a Sphinx. Now, when we think about Paulina Zelitsky's work and the incredible ruins that she's been able to find, I have better shots of her city, but that'll give us some idea right there. Those are pyramids basically underwater, and that's off the tip of Cuba. The others are closer to Bimini, but they never disclose the actual location. Now, later in the program, I'm going to read from Andrew Collins' work about an entire pyramid setup structure that was found off the coast of Florida. And this one is interesting me a lot because of the type of research that I've been doing. But one last quick look at this, and we'll bring it back again. So this Sphinx found underwater in 2014. Now, these stories, when they come up, a couple of things happen. One, an archaeologist or a group that's searching, they hit the ground running. They spend the time and the money and the effort, and then they get this big find. And then they tell people about the big find. And when they won't disclose certain things, they're afraid because other groups will come in there, or the Navy will come in there, or somebody else will scoop it up. Especially underwater, it can be very lawless regardless. And so you find a lot of people coming forward with this type of information, good photographs, good eyewitness testimony, and then the story gets suppressed somewhere along the line. Something happens to the story. I have, for tonight's show, several good examples, but I'm going to read a little bit from this one. And we certainly know that these types of things happen, so we'll keep an open mind with this. This is in NASA, actually, where Carmen Bolter just left with a team and ran into some weather issues for us, unfortunately, tonight. But as I said, we are going to have her back, so we'll work that out with her. Quote, a team of underwater archaeologists studying an ancient shipwreck of unknown origin near the eastern coast of the Bahamas have made an astonishing discovery, a large stone statue resembling greatly in shape and design the Egyptian Great Sphinx. Now the team speaks. We're not absolutely certain at the moment as to what this discovery actually means, explained James Nielsen, a historian part of the research team. The erosion caused by the natural elements and the various corals and life forms who settled on it have been disturbing our scientific dating attempts, but the nature of the mineral used in its construction confirms beyond the shadow of a doubt that the statue is of Middle Eastern origin. Now, this is particularly fascinating because it suggests not only were they adopting the same structures and the same building techniques, but actually the stone itself, they are assuming it comes from the Middle East. Now, this raises a lot of questions because there's extensive trade that's been suggested. And a lot of people have always said, well, the Phoenicians came over, but the Egyptians, it's harder to imagine because they weren't that seafaring. In fact, they were, but one of the things that Egerton Sykes showed evidence of was the ancient Egyptians working with the Phoenicians when they needed to go somewhere. And so this would be Egyptians using Phoenician ships. Now that also suggests kind of a more, a later date. My own instinct when I was looking at these and thinking about the research and work from Casey's point of view, et cetera, is that these are actually artifacts from that culture that was there. And that the culture that was there is far older than, say, the Phoenicians or what we give credit for to the ancient Egyptians, say about 3000 BC. Casey was talking about a culture 10,500 BC that existed there in the Hotzone. And he said that Bimini formed the very heart of it. of a huge continent. So Poseidia was the dominant island, and Poseidia was that side where the Hotzone is. So that would include Cuba, it would include Bimini, and it would include the Bahamas. On the other side, they had other islands, which he called Arion and Og. Now, Arion is the larger mass that was over by Spain, and that's where there's so many underwater photographs of pyramids and things like that. So we're going all in on this nature of it, which is there's all kinds of underwater ruins that are rising, and that we're getting the type of equipment and advanced satellite. And what they're calling it is archaeology from space, because the satellites are doing the job now. They're peering down. The question is not so much, can we see these things? Can we get our hands on them? We certainly can. The problem is the groups that control these types of things and that launch these types of things, like I showed with the Hotzone and the NDA, when people are down there, they have all kinds of NDAs of blocking people from repeating this type of information. So we're really in a quandary here. How do we get our hands on this without relying on just the official archaeology story, which always is bogus, and they always have to catch up, and then 100 years later tell us the truth. And even if we can get them to do that, and there's so many missing chapters in history that people like Graham Hancock have spent a whole lifetime bringing forward, that we need a new way, we need a new method. Our entryway, in my mind, is not based, we hear a lot of stories about there might be ancient structures in Antarctica, and we need information about Antarctica. But for my money, the war-torn Middle East and Antarctica are not the place to go to find those answers in relation to our past. The Hotzone, although it is a geopolitical hotbed, is still more accessible, and it's more weather-friendly by a long shot. And launching an expedition in the Hotzone and finding this out is infinitely more practical than some of the more far-flung things to do. As we hear, you think about things and they were like, well, let's crash the gates of Area 51. And we saw how that fizzled out. And then
God, it was humiliating.
And then we hear another thing, let's go crash Antarctica, So this is how the media gets stories going, but it's to keep you going round and round. There's no reason for any of that. Really, we have now a solid tradition of research scientifically that matches up with some of the mystery school research, say from people like Edgar Cayce. We can bring those worlds together with some of these experts, like Paulina Zelitsky, like Graham Hancock, like G.G. Young, and really bring it to a different level of people working there in cooperation, utilizing different skill sets, scientific skill sets, oceanography skill sets, language skill sets, archaeology, and psychic archaeology. These are the aspects I think that can get us somewhere on this, and that's the way I would roll on that one. This story goes on to suggest that there's no question that what they were seeing was Egyptian, and that the Sphinx that they witnessed down there had, we get an idea of the mass. It certainly was quite large. Now, the city that Zelitsky saw was much more than just a couple of statues. I mean, these are impressive because they suggest that link in Sphinx making, because that is a particularly Middle Eastern aspect. But in terms of Zelitsky's find off the coast of Cuba, we have something which is an incredible revelation, because it's an entire city, it's an entire metropolis. So I want to move us around to the work of Egerton Sykes and bring us back to this. And then I have something else that's kind of explosive here. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are going deep now in episode X69, and this is Egyptian Mysteries, Pharaohs in the Hotzone. How do we bring those two worlds of ancient Egypt together with the early Americas and the Bahamas? Well, it is through the understanding of the lost continent of Atlantis, the civilization that disappeared from history and disappeared from our consciousness. All the echoes of this civilization and all the information we have from people like Edgar Cayce and Rudolf Steiner is that this was a very advanced culture, and they were far advanced beyond what we have in the 21st century, as extraordinary as that may seem. This high technology had an aspect to it, according to Cayce and Steiner, that involved spiritual advancement, so that it required a kind of spiritual advancement in order to operate this technology, which is something very interesting when you think about it, because it's like, hey, you pop open your laptop and you're dealing with these advanced spiritual forces. That's the way we would think about it. So the story becomes very old, but it awakens something in our memory collectively. And that's where I think we're going with this. That's why Edgar Cayce and Steiner and Graham Hancock and Anthony West and all these people have such a power to the work that they've done, is it awakens something that's deep in our unconscious. And we hold those things. You know, when we see some of the work on deep psychology from people like Carl Jung, and he talks about collective unconscious. This is the idea that if, you know, someone's in a military situation and they see, for example, the remains of an alien, that on some level we have all seen it because we're all connected in that sense. And so we have that unconscious understanding that it's so. So this is the kind of thing I think that we bring together when we're looking at Atlantis. Very important. I want to remind you to go to the darkjournalist.com website.
Oh, yeah. Forgot all about it.
And sign up for our newsletter, actually. It's the best way to stay in touch with us.
Because what have you found out this week about YouTube?
All kinds of things. It's remarkable. But I'll tell you, go to darkjournalist.com and use the newsletter link. That'll keep you in touch with us all the way through the bizarre things that are going on with social media and how they are throwing people off left and right and suppressing subscribers and all the rest, which they do with us continually.
Big time.
And the thing is, like, you know, when people tell me it doesn't happen for me, you know, when I sign up for the YouTube subscription, it doesn't show me your stuff. My answer over and over again is just sign up for the newsletter, because that's the only way that I can guarantee we'll have a direct pipeline. And it's a much easier way to go. It's a free newsletter, and it keeps you and I in touch. There's going to be some very important things relating to events that are coming up in there. So you want to be on there to make sure you get that information first. So go ahead. It's the kind of thing where we get it out once a week on Friday and let you know what shows are coming up and what incredible guests we have coming. And I can tell you the guest list that we've assembled for October and November is is one of the best ever that I can imagine. So make sure that you're signed up there. We'll go for it. Okay. Egerton Sykes. I want to bring Mr. Sykes in because he gives us, with his background on Atlantis and what he did for 40 years, the missing pieces that I think a lot of researchers miss who go into this. Because Sykes wasn't a big one to, you know, he collected scientists, he went to Russia, he went to France, he worked with the best people on this. He wasn't concerned with best-selling books, although, you know, he's done the foreword for things like Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, the classic by Ignatius Donnelly. And he had the background. I'm sorry, but, you know, the intelligence background gave him that edge. And I think what happened is, at the end of his life, this large-scale library that he donated to the Association for Research and Enlightenment, you know, that library wasn't digitized by the ARE, and there it is, this big lumbering mass. And so we have all these incredible stories about who's looked at that material. But Sykes is certainly important. Let's deal with a couple of things right off the bat with Sykes. One, in the March 1952 issue of Atlantis, which was a journal that he started, this was titled Cuba and Atlantis, and it was by Feo Garcia Ucres. And this is the president of the Cuban Institute of Archaeology. It states that the possibility that the island of Cuba was once in some way related to the submerged continent of Atlantis and was discussed at the Cuban Institute of Archaeology. This is the conclusion they had come to after a decade of work. And this is back there in 1952. You think about it. This is a real warning shot for what's coming in the future. And so in Punta del Este, the Isle of Pines, there were prehistoric caves with petroglyphs and astronomical symbols, and a staircase leading to a rudimentary observatory. These are extraordinary. I've shown these on the show on a number of occasions. And interestingly enough, just before Paulina Zelitsky found her incredible lost city off Cuba, she went there. she was inspired by this incredible cave art. Now, this is Sykes. The Bahamas, a group of 700 small islands stretch from the southeast of Florida as far as Cuba. The Bimini Islands of this group lie 50 miles east of Miami. 50 miles. It's not far. It's very easy to get to. You can get there in less than an hour. The largest of the Bahamian islands, Andros, lies south of Bimini. One thing that's not mentioned here is that Andros is home to AUTEC, which is the underwater Area 51 that the United States launches all their very unusual underwater experiments. And there's been a lot of UFO activity related to that. Andros, compared to Bimini, by the way, is gigantic. It's like, you know, comparing maybe Cuba to the United States. I mean, it's such an incredible difference in size dimensionally that when we think of Andros, we must think of a much larger island there in the Bahamas. It's actually the largest one there. Now, this is back to Sykes. Now, actually, his interest in Bimini actually began when he published a report on the Horace Gueva finds in Bermuda in 1958. Since that time, he's watched with interest every bit of field work and checked up carefully on all source material. This is from an article by Anne Ruby, who operated something called Sea Child, which had all this information about Sykes, but apparently she's retired. In the January 1978 issue of New World, Sykes published the Bimini question. And he said, quote, Dr. Manson Valentine, who found the Bimini Wall, and another archaeologist named Rebikov, discovered a sunken temple off the Bahamian island of Andros. Okay, now we've never seen the pictures of this. And this is quite fascinating because if they found a temple, we don't know anything about it. But this one's off Andros, and Andros is very close, as we've said, to Bimini. It's literally easily interconnected. And I'm going to show some maps a little bit later as we get along here. Now, Bimini is a hot topic and believed to be the home of the Temple of Translucent Walls, as referred to by Augustus Le Plongeon. These are the great crystal temples that are remembered. And you hear this in Celtic and Druid lore. When they would go down there, they would see these incredible translucent temples. One of the things that Casey said was that, you know, they had these healing centers there and that there was a healing well. And this is one of the things that drew the Hemingways to live there in the 1930s. And before he died in 1982, this was something that Lester Hemingway, who was Ernest Hemingway's brother, was bringing to light. So Sykes believed that Bimini was known to the Egyptians at least from the reign of Hatshepsut onwards, the name itself being a combination of two gods, Bin and Min. Okay, one of those is a bird god, and he actually traced the lineage of the etymology for the name Bimini to its Egyptian origins. Now, both the names concern the eternal youth, which is interesting because we hear again when we get to Ponce de Leon and we're getting into this incredible idea of a healing well. This is quite kind of the fascinating turn and twist. Sykes was originally resistant to the idea of Bimini being associated with Atlantis, but after a lifetime of research, including Roman, Irish, Greek, Phoenician, Egyptian, and Welsh sources, Sykes concluded that the Bimini, Andros, Miami complex and Murias, the encircled city of the west of the Tuatha De Danann, an early Celtic tribe, were one and the same. This is really good because it's good news because Murias, there's a lot of material on in that Celtic literature based around the Tuatha De Danann, which we've done a few programs on, and we're probably doing more in relation to them being these kind of offshoot outpost of Atlantis. Now, he put these two together, which is quite fascinating, and he also published a book of Celtic lore. He was one of the foremost experts on it. Now, Murias may have been destroyed by the Great Meteor Strike, according to Sykes. He believes that there was a great meteor strike off the Carolina coast. He believed that the Bimini Murias site was an administrative complex, temple, and trading post with its own harbor, and until 3000 BC, the island may have many Old World visitors, including Etruscans, Minoans, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Basque, Celts, and Norsemen. The Bimini Temple survived due to its location on top of a hill. So this is like the very top of a mountain that overlooked Poseidon and Atlantis. Sykes expressed concern about the absence of a common objective among investigators working on the underwater sites between Florida and Jamaica, where everyone was only concerned with their own discoveries and failed to appreciate the immense bigger picture of Bimini Mirius. Okay, now I'm going to go into his direct quote here, but so we're getting an idea. Sykes had it. He understood the Hotzone. He understood that when you look at that area and you're going around from Cuba, which he spent a lot of time trying to get information on, and he said that the Russians and the Chinese and the Cubans and the Americans were all after the ruins that were there. This is, of course, he died before Paulina Zelitsky's incredible find of a city off the coast of Cuba. But we're getting the hints there now that when Sykes brings it in, Sykes coming from intelligence, he understands that there's an intelligence link to the research around these ruins. And he starts to get us into the geopolitical aspect of why it's a touchy subject and why the Russians are down there and all the rest. So that's very important because we have to understand almost a kind of the deep state around this. So it's sort of a deep archaeological state that's controlling these ruins. And this gets us into something that I've discussed on this program with Joseph Farrell, which is archaeological wars. So this idea that there are these incredible relics that are very important from history and that these different countries want them because they represent a kind of power symbol, but they may act as keys for certain types of technology if they're studied. And so this goes on over and over again. And we've recently seen now that one of the things that they developed the U-2 for wasn't just to spy on whether or not the Russians were making nuclear bombs, but we have information now which says that they were doing extensive aerial archaeology with the U-2. And that's to get the advantage on these types of ruins. Exactly. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I had a really interesting comment here. Give me 1 second. From Old Hat. Says David Zink, in his search for Atlantis, used the services of psychic Carol Huffstickler,
yes,
who informed him that around 28,000 BC, the gods came to Earth from the Pleiades. What do you know about that?
Yeah, she actually said, and it's in the book. I think I have it right here. Stones of Atlantis.
How handy.
I love it. As seen on the Cousteau Society special, Calypso's Search for Atlantis.
Cool.
Yeah, this is a fascinating book, and there's a whole chapter dealing with the psychic aspects. I actually recommend checking it out. One of the more interesting things that they found when they were doing that was this pillar that was underwater. Let's see if I can actually show this. And the pillar is lit, according to everyone who's seen it, so that you're along this dark ocean floor, and then suddenly there's a lit pillar. So, there's no good explanation for that in terms of ocean phosphorus or whatever, but the pillar itself would light up the whole area. So something was still charged down there. When we get into areas and questions about things like the Bermuda Triangle and all the rest of it, and we see magnetic compasses spinning and planes disappearing and people going through dimensions and or flying through there for a half hour and only being gone for 5 minutes and things like that. It gets into areas that on this program we call apotheum, which is there's an effect and a reality distortion effect that takes place when you are dealing with certain types of technologies that the Atlanteans had. This is the same type of thing when people report UFO contact, they're getting floated through walls. And it seems like time stands still. They lose time. There's missing time. Electrical things fail. Car motors fail. Whole cities are blacked out in some cases.
Everybody wants to see that book again.
Oh, the pillar, or
no,
the
book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The name of the book is The Stones of Atlantis by David Zink. Dr. David Zink, who was a fellow of the Explorers Club, he was somebody who tried very hard to bring this story out. He did not get the support from the archaeological. They really wanted to shut him down. They didn't like his methods and all the rest of it. But actually, he called in a number of incredible astronomical correlations. It was one of the first people to use archaeoastronomy to locate ruins. So this is very important. So he's a breakthrough figure, and he was not somebody who I think is celebrated enough now when we look back at his work, but certainly he's somebody who's done amazing things in relation to this.
Spiritus has a really interesting question. Are the Pleiadians the same as Steiner's use of seraphim and cherubim coming to the first incarnation of Earth, Saturn, and bringing its spirit?
You know, it's fascinating. It is a depth question. And when you're talking about Steiner's cosmology, he talks all about these higher beings that are associated with our development. So you could look at them that way. A lot of people like to look at things in sort of nuts and bolts way, and they imagine that the Greys are just physical types of beings from other planets that have physical craft the way we have physical craft, and that the Pleiadians are like that too. You know, it's always my impression that there's a dimensional quality to those things, which is not similar to the physical, but that they can show up in the physical. And so there's no question when we've seen UFO activity, it is followed on by apotheum style effects, you know, just like when they just disappear and blink out and things like that. Now, when we get into things like crash saucers, you're talking about questions like that, it gets pretty heavy, because then we have our hands on that technology that's come through that dimensional door, or it's come, you know, from somewhere very far away. And so when we reprogram that, the idea is, can we use that technology? Can we re-engineer UFOs and get that power from doing that? I think there's no question on some level that's true, but we'd be missing a big piece of the pie if we just regarded it as a physical problem. But we've seen that there are groups inside the government who, after capturing these things, wanted to protect those secrets and use that technology to kind of lord it over other groups one way or another. That's one way to look at it. So I call that group X-Protect, because we've seen them over and over again, and they're associated with things like the Men in Black and all the rest of it. So when you had people describing UFO incidents that they didn't want to come out, they'd go there and intimidate them, but they seem to use almost supernatural means to do that. So I think that we have to look at it a little bit differently. I've identified another group inside that national security state structure and the deep aspects of it that we call X-Share. And that's a group of scientists, political figures, even military figures who want to do that. I can tell you that on the X-Protect side, I've found a lot of intelligence people, mostly CIA people. And on the X-Share side, I've found none. So that'll give you some idea of who's who. But I do think it's important to look at those two groups battling it out to keep that technology secret. Because if you have very advanced technology like that, then you're going into different places. But I think Steiner was talking about it cosmologically. He's telling us about spiritual origins. So it's an interesting thing to tie in Pleiadians with that. We always get that thing about, you know, those really intense contact stories, and you have the kind of blonde, blue-eyed aliens, the Nordics, and everyone. That's where the whole Pleiadian story goes. But the truth is, we just don't know. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X episode 69 now. Pharaohs, Egyptian mystery in the Hotzone. This is where we're finding Egyptian artifacts like the Sphinx that we showed, but we're finding it right there in that Hotzone area, encompassing the Bahamas, Cuba, Yucatan, and aspects going down into the Caribbean. If we think about that, so many of the mysteries that we've talked about on this program seem to go back over and over again into this Hotzone. And Casey, in the readings that he gave on Bimini, said that Bimini was the site of the first of these risings. So he pictured it as a series of risings that were going to happen in relation to the Hotzone that would let everyone know, oh, okay, as this land is appearing, we're seeing what was under there. And we're seeing these large-scale structures. You know, we're seeing incredibly advanced architecture under there. So I think we can think of the Hotzone story as a land rising story on one hand, and then the ancient technology, advanced technology aspect. These are the two pieces I think that will give us the best way to look at it. I think that Casey was trying to give us the impression by predicting the date it would be found that this is part of something which is inevitable. And he was trying to tell us this is the time, the 21st century is the time when we rediscover these things. So it's good for us to get the jump on it now, because I can guarantee you in the next decade, this is going to be a big story about land rising. And there's going to be a lot of false information in relation to it. Just look at the false information around the UFO file, the TTSA and the horrible things that we see from the CIA infiltration of things of this nature. So we have to be vigilant and have our own fundamental base of information when it comes to that. But you're watching the Dark Journalist program. We're going to be taking questions in the second half of the program relating to this kind of fascinating lost civilization there in the Bahamas. And so you can ask your question all in caps. Miss Olivia will be taking care of that. And
can I ask you a question right now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so Truth Flower wanted to know, will the magnetic reversal bring the land up? A lot of people want to know about that. Like, what is the mechanism by which the land is rising?
Yeah.
And what did Casey say about the poles reversing?
This is a really actually important question. While I answer that, can you turn that back to where it was?
Okay.
Fantastic. Well, we're getting more and more information about the magnetic side. And the whole term about a pole shift, when we get into that information at its core, there were people who were studying it and spending their lives dedicated to this had happened in the past. And it's a cataclysmic activity when they change. And one of the classic things is that, we found the remains of this mastodon who was eating these kind of dandelions and stuff. And he still had it in his mouth when we found him frozen. And they were still kind of nice and like daisies. So obviously it happened incredibly quick. And so Casey suggested that the poles shifted for the Atlanteans and that caused one of their destructions. But that the major destruction with Atlantis was actually caused by something called the Two-Eye Stone. And the Two-Eye Stone, which is spelled Tuaoi, is something which is very unique to the Casey material, because Theosophy and Anthroposophy talk about the incredible power that the Atlanteans had, but they don't say how they got it. And the Two-Eye Stone is something that Casey said is a crystal that they used in terms of power stations, so that they would set up the power stations all across these various areas. One of the major power stations was in Poseidia, which is off the east coast of America. And in that area, Casey was saying Bimini was a piece of Poseidia. So we have to understand when we think about things like the Bermuda Triangle and stuff, that the massive destruction that the Two-Eye Stone brought is, we could think of it like a nuclear blast, but it's more magnetic and even spiritual the way that it happens. So the echoes of that magnetically, physically, and spiritually are all there still. And so when we have these planes that fly through the Bermuda Triangle, these ships that disappear, I think there's magnetic anomalies in that area anyway because of the currents and all the rest of it. I think it's quite a PowerPoint when we think of the Earth, but geomagnetically. But I think what's particularly important is this echo, this story of the Two-Eye Stone, and what Casey said it came to be called the terrible crystal. Now, originally, the enlightened Atlanteans had used it to interface with these higher spiritual beings, and they had trained a group of priestesses to do that. So they would have the ability, through attuning themselves through the technology, to talk to these beings from the outer spheres. And that's very unique, I think, and that's why I think the civilization was so advanced. And the way that Casey described it was that there were two groups. One of the groups was the Emilius group, and the other one was the Belial group, and that the Emilius children of one group were the ones who used it for spiritual purposes, and the Belial group said, that's great that you're using it that way, but guess what? It's like a gigantic laser, so let's have some fun here. When we think about that, it makes a lot more sense. It gives us an understanding that this, rediscovering the 20th century of atomic power and things as a memory. And we've seen how quickly we could destroy ourselves. As we sit here now, because of all the saber rattling that we've done with Russia, they built something called the Satan II missile, which is locked and loaded with nukes. Satan II.
What happened to Satan I?
That's a good question. But Satan II is very advanced nuclear.
We
missile.
paid for this as taxpayers?
No. That's the Russians doing.
Oh,
that to
okay.
us, yes.
All right.
We have our own, which are even more terrifying. Now, the funny thing is, if you go into this history, and we won't go off on too much of a tangent here, but Reagan with Gorbachev suggested we can go down to 0 nuclear weapons, which meant we have a totally different energy source. And they had discovered something completely different. And the idea was, let's just get rid of these nukes because they're dangerous. But instead, now we have people talking about nuclear buildup and nuclear arms races. And, the Clintons, when they were trying to get in the White House this time, were all pushing this Cold War II thing against the Russians. And they wanted to create this whole nuclear scenario. And we still see that in the psychotic and MSNBC style media where they go, oh, the Russians are coming to get you. Somehow the liberals who used to protect the Russians, if you look back in like the 80s and 90s, they became completely psychotically like Joseph McCarthy or something from the 50s with the Red Scare. And anyone who doesn't like New World Order ideas is a Russian spy or something. And so this is the kind of thing that they use. And I think what happened there on a deep level is that all this stuff, even around the ruins and the things that we're talking about, a lot of it is strategizing between groups of how they can get advantage. And over again, it comes back to secret advanced technology and our secret history. The problem, I think, if we discover Atlantean ruins, if we discover this older history, the things that other people have tried to help bring forward, like John Anthony West or Graham Hancock, what happens is that we get the ability to rediscover ourselves, and we remember the story, and then we open up to the mystery school material. And basically, a lot of what has been, the way that they've harvested humanity, these groups that are small in number, but incredibly powerful, a lot of that power goes away. And I think that these groups feel, one, that we can't handle that information. And these are the kind of elite, I guess you would call them. But what's interesting is that even deep in the mystery schools who try to move humanity forward, they also get concerned about what humanity will do, because the elite groups themselves have shown the very base instincts of right is might and all the rest. Might is right, is that it? Mm-hmm. So it's a deep kind of philosophical question. So when we come back around to people who've opened this question up, like Egerton Sykes and his work on the Hotzone, we know we have to revisit this now. This is the time for us to get a handle on this now. Look, next year is going to be a presidential election. Already, all we hear about is impeachment. We hear political questions nonstop, insane stuff, one group making fun of another group, and then the Extinction Rebellion people who are completely doing all this performance art stuff. Oh. But the viciousness against the Trump administration and, the vitriol from the people on the other side against the Democrats and stuff, the left has just gone completely insane. So next year, it's going to be such a wall of noise that while we have this time period just right here, we've got the hot zone in our sights. We've got the ability to get our hands on this deeper mystery before all hell breaks loose next year with this, circus of run for president and see what happens. So I say that, we can take advantage of this period of time, and that's why I think this work is important. And I do feel like it's going to come down to individual effort on individual parts of individuals, not so much relying on the institutions to kind of move the culture forward. It's going to be up to us, and in formats like this, in situations like this, moving the situation forward.
What was Casey's formula about the individual and then the group?
That's true. Well, he was talking more about the success of any business entity, and he said,
well, it's just first for everything.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's great wisdom, and it's when you go first with any idea, you go first to the individual, then to the group, then to the classes, then to the masses. It is a very interesting formula when you think about it. So right now we're going to the individual, the group, and the classes and the masses. But anyway, you're watching the Dark Journalist Program X Series episode 69. We're going deep into the Hotzone. Let's see what Sykes is telling us in relation to what is happening down there. Now, he told us that it was problematic that people were concerned just with their own little discovery and they weren't seeing the big picture, that this was one whole piece of a continent down there and a dominant piece. So, quote, this is Bimini Murius by Egerton Sykes. There is still considerable activity going on in the investigation of the submerged ruins in this reading. This is 1978. Okay, that's 40 some odd years ago. And he's saying there's considerable activity going on investigating those ruins. As readers know, I think that this was an administrative religious complex, Bimini, having its own harbor, portions of which have already come to light. What is of major concern is the absence of common objective among all those working on these sites. Here we have a series of underwater sites in the region between Florida and Jamaica. This is interesting, his drawing of that line from Florida to Jamaica. Must be considered as the remains of an earlier culture which was eliminated in two stages, the first by a meteor strike around 10,000 BC. This is what Graham Hancock talks about. And this is the whole Younger Dryas theory that this comet, which is getting a lot more support now. I would say there's no question that something major like that happened, but apparently this 2-eye crystal power source implosion is another factor to contend with. But continuing on. So now everyone is so concerned with their own discoveries that they fail to appreciate the immensity of the problem, which involves an area about 1 million square miles littered with islands, both large and extremely small, which has never been considered in total since the death of Mitchell Hedges. Now, it's interesting he mentions Mitchell Hedges because Mitchell Hedges discovered the crystal skull. And that was a discovery in the Yucatan. And that skull, which is still shown occasionally today, is absolutely an authentic relic. And I think that it's quite a conundrum. And it's something that we have to think about in terms of people like Hedges, who, again, were down there much like Egerton Sykes in a dual role, because on one hand, he's an archaeologist, and on the other hand, he was an early intelligence gatherer who was hired out. So we're getting that mix there. We have to always understand whenever we're dealing with the Hotzone, you're dealing with a mix. The mix is always intelligence on one hand and archaeological on the other. And so the geopolitical hotbed that's going on down there, that's why. So he says the Bermuda Triangle is but a minor aspect of the problem. Practically the only person who's been willing to visualize the question as a whole is Dr. Manson Valentine. He's the one who discovered the Bimini Wall. In spite of much discouragement in his home state of Florida, this becomes very important with what I'm about to show. To recapitulate, in BC 10,000, there was a culture in the region which was eliminated by a meteor strike. Its successor was largely eliminated by the flooding of what he's calling the Linotian Plain, which we know as the bed of the Caribbean Sea. Bridging the two cultures were a series of contacts of Mediterranean races. These visitors left traces. And he lists a series of bullet points, and he talks about artificial skull deformations practiced by the Maya and in the Caribbean and in both South and North America. And he said when he goes into this, he actually mentions aspect of how the psychic and the occult plays a role in a lot of these cultures, all the way from Barbados to Bimini. So that's very interesting. It was one of the funny things I found out about Andros was this idea of a love potion that they were famously known for in the 17th century. So he says, just to kind of round out his thinking on all this, He says, I know most of the people are concerned and wonder if it would not be possible for their activities to be coordinated by affiliation to either an existing organization or a new one. I prefer the already existing one as it involves practically no immediate cash outlay to create something new. Endeavors have been made to arrange a small symposium in Miami in the fall of this year. And then he goes on to talk about it. So he mentions also that the questions about looking at this psychically and also the questions about UFO sightings in the area are important, and that they have to be, but those types of applications haven't been as advanced as archaeology, and so that those were coming up and around. It is interesting when we think about it, since we've come 40 years on psychic discovery and on the UFO file, if we aren't ready to now utilize those fully as part of the research around doing this. That's what I'm getting when I look at this in particular. Miss Olivia. Okay, what do you got?
They wonder whether you're wearing flip-flops.
No, well, I mean, I have
studded flip-flops, but you don't.
No, I wear ankle boots.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the final piece with Egerton Sykes. It's pretty good. I was thinking, here comes the Hotzone question, and no, it's a shoe question. I guess they're kind of like Star Trek boots.
Yes, they are. Little Chelsea boots, right?
All right. Quote, Egerton Sykes. This is based on the supposition that the sea itself was a vast meteorite crater and that it held the Atlantic Ocean back for thousands of years. After this, the various tables lands on the mountains became islands. To my mind, the whole of the seabed should contain an extremely valuable archaeological material for future investigation. This is the incredible legacy that Sykes left us. And I would say that when we take the fact that he brought in the best scientists, language experts, topography people, he understood the mapping of it. He took it very seriously. He understood the impact that this was going to make. So we need to, although there was a great lapse between, say, the early 80s when Sykes died and this era, and it seems to me even the good researchers have ignored Sykes' work, we've had that lapse there for about 30 years. But now we can pick up, along with the incredible new finds that we have from people like Zelitsky, we can pick up all the research that we have from Sykes, which I think is absolutely crucial. So Sykes becomes a very important piece of this when looking at it, if we want to get a new idea of how to put that together. And remember, most of what he put together was scientific. Okay, a couple of things I want to mention in relation to this is there have been some remarkable finds right here in America, in Florida, in the Hotzone. And a couple of them I showed on a program, but I want to go in depth on these for a minute and explain their origin. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series episode 69, Pharaohs, Egyptian Mysteries in the Hotzone. We're going deep into the Hotzone, and there's a good reason for it, which is we're coming into this knowledge of land rising and artifacts being found there. And it is not necessarily a slow lumbering process of doing this. This may happen very quickly, especially if we have the information. So let's take a quick look at something discovered in East Florida by someone named Clarence Bloomfield Moore. This, to me, is his version. This is a copper plate, which has been oxidized, and is far more superior to the other ruins that are in the area. And because of the type of oxidization that occurred with it, it's very hard to date, but they put it somewhere back behind 3000 BC, which makes it very old for North America. This very unusual find with the four centers and the vortex in the middle is an indication, a representation of this power source of the Two Eyes Stone. This is my interpretation of it. What happens when we look at this expedition is also very interesting. And it's centered largely in Putnam there. So you might, for those who are interested in looking at it, the expedition itself is well cataloged in a book called The East Florida Expeditions of Clarence Bloomfield Moore. I searched high and low for this book, and of course it took Olivia to find it, and she found it in
I'm an excellent shopper.
But that was good research on her part. We had the name of the book, and I actually had sections of the book, but the full version of it, it was so great. You know, when I do those types of things, I'm like, well, I just can't find the actual book. And Olivia's like, oh yeah, you know, she'll take a good like 6 minutes and she'll find it. But what's fascinating about the book is Bloomfield Moore is someone who had a very rich background in history, because his mother, being Clara Jessup Moore, was the person who was responsible for funding John Keely's work. And if you look at Keely's work, he was kind of the sort of twin of the Tesla work, but on a different angle. He was working more of etheric energy. And he had developed motors, and the Keely motor is quite the sensation around the turn of the century, of the 19th into the 20th century. Now, Clara Jessup Moore is interesting also for the reason of her background and her family. We've discussed it off and on in a couple of programs here, including the fact that her daughters went on to marry into the Van Rosen family, and the Van Rosens would use those swastika long before the Nazis on their planes, and that this Hermann Goering has discovered this symbol and brought it back. This is one of the stories of how the Nazis were using this. The Nazis also used the Theosophical Society logo, extrapolating those ideas and misusing those ideas. But it is very interesting when we think about the impact with Bloomfield Moore. Again, Clara Jessup, having done work funding Nikola Tesla in his early work, and Nikola Tesla creating these wireless energy towers. And this is the thing he discovered. Hey, you guys forget about wireless communications. I can actually beam energy the same way. You don't even need to go through this whole fossil fuel paradigm. And everyone and their grandmother just wanted him dead after that. So, and they did knock him out of the picture quite successfully. But the important thing is, I think, when we look at Clara Jessup Moore, is to keep her in mind, because she became the person who vouchsafed to the Theosophical Society and Annie Besant the advanced technology that Keely had left behind, and that Helena Blavatsky, who was the head of the Theosophical Society, wrote about extensively, and what it would do basically to the culture if the culture got its hands on it. Basically, you'd have people dropping bombs on each other into eternity. It was that potent, that transformative to humanity, and the Theosophical Society just felt, we can't let this out because it would be misused. Now, it's very interesting, the role of the mystery schools. We've discussed it on a number of occasions, but it comes up in this context a lot, because we can see the connection here. Later on, Clara Jessup will go on and be in the court of Queen Victoria. And like I said, her daughters would marry into the Van Rosen family. When we see the kind of interlacing of the Theosophical Society and these individuals with these expeditions, we start to get a picture of where archaeology, even in America, comes from. And one of the best early archaeologists was Augustus Le Plongeon. What did he utilize? Psychic archaeology. So we have to think about where this stuff comes from, and how important it is for us to get a handle on what were the motives of the people who are getting this out there. In her case, she's so aware of alternative energy that her son, with all of this experience of being with his mother, and her theosophical connections and her connections to Keely and Tesla, that when he sets off on an expedition into the Hotzone and finds the two-eyed stone representation, it's kind of a big deal. And I want to say here that this representation is also kind of fascinating to me, because I've looked at a lot of archaeology over the years, and I have never, and I mean never, ever seen this. Bloomfield Moore's books and expeditions have not been well appreciated over time. And that's actually a picture of the same thing, but stripping away the phosphorus. it is quite fascinating. I think as we get closer to this mystery, we're going to discover that this Atlantis story can't be washed away. And this is part of what, when I was talking with Carmen about it, she was talking about all the discoveries that she's made in relation to this. And that's why it's going to be important when we have her come on the program. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. Now, we're in X Series 69. This is Pharaohs in the Hotzone. We're going deep into the Atlantis Egyptian mystery on this. We were originally going to have Dr. Carmen Bolter, but she got caught up traveling from Nassau to Florida in the Hotzone with her crew. And but we talked about having her come back on while she's still here in America. She makes her home in Spain now, and she still does those wonderful Egyptian tours. I can just imagine being on one of her Egyptian tours. That would be,
I would love it.
Think about it.
It'd be incredible.
Quite remarkable because she knows it so well.
But I don't want to go without Gigi.
Exactly.
Because that past life recall is going to be incredible.
It'll go right off the charts. Something else that Bloomfield Moore found. No question. I think all those expeditions are going to would be greatly enhanced by Gigi Young. But it is interesting to me that Bloomfield Moore, when he goes, if you look through what he's finding, he'll find like, oh, here's a stone flute or something. And then in the middle of all this stuff in Putnam, he finds this incredibly advanced stuff. And there's no explanation for it. There's no correlation for it. And it's this incredible sort of mystery that just lingers out there. And so they decided, well, it doesn't fit in with any of the other discoveries, so forget it. One of the other things that he found is here, which again is a representation of these power centers. Now, the way Casey describes the power centers is that they gave the Atlanteans the ability for flight. It gave them the ability for flying not only place to place, but through things. So dematerialization, flying under the water, and taking photography at a distance and through things, again, dematerialization. I don't think that we have yet the real archaeology around the firestones, the two-eye stones, but Casey suggested that in Yucatan, there was an expedition in 1933, and they took the artifacts that they didn't know what they were to the University of Pennsylvania, and then he also suggested the Pennsylvania Museum. And they still get questions today. If you go to their website, you can see this thing saying, we don't have the Casey firestones. The firestones are very interesting, and they show up in the work of people who try to research the Casey readings. And Casey had suggested that they were kind of portable versions, maybe smaller versions of these two-eye stones. The two-eye stones are massive, and they, kind of capture this whole panorama, and they would be like a major power center that would use the sun and use the stars to utilize that kind of power technique. But the portable ones might only be as big as, say, a computer screen, something like that.
Right. There's a theory that that's what they're holding, the little
in the bag.
hand purses.
It could well be. And that would give them the ability to really kind of appear impressive when they show up.
There's something going on with those man purses.
I have had extensive talks about those. And what's interesting is that they're in Assyria, they're in Egypt, and they're in Mexico. They're in the Mayans. There's the same representation. So they obviously know where that's coming from. I want to show this quickly, and I've mentioned about how there was this scientist named Hudson who was a NASA scientist and decided that Casey's two-eye stone was described technically enough that he could build a model of it. Now, he built a scale model just to get an idea. I don't think he ever made the real thing. But that gives us an idea of what it is, six-sided, and it's interestingly enough, when it's turned, it creates the Star of David kind of effect. But I do feel it's important for us to understand what it might, to get some inkling of how this power station operated, because after all, it's one of the contributing causes. It actually broke up and destroyed Atlantis. Now, one of the things that we've been hearing a lot about is off the coast of Florida, again, pyramids. Now, in a previous episode, we went into these letters between J. Manson Valentine and a mysterious Michael Hudson, who were looking at pyramids in the Everglades and exchanging explanations about it. And one of the weird things is that, the person who's working at the museum and found these incredible letters, he writes an article for the Miami News Times in what is basically the senior citizen section. And I ran across this thing. And as I was reading it, I found it quite remarkable because he's trying to get a handle on if Manson Valentine really saw these ruins there off the coast of Florida in the Everglades. And he finds out that the person who was working at the museum is in his 80s now, but he called him up and he was like, do you remember these letters between J. Manson Valentine and this guy? They talked about pyramids, all the rest of it. And the guy says, oh, yeah, actually, they took me to see them. I saw the pyramids too. So there's a little subculture here who's seen those pyramids in Florida, actually in Florida. Now, we also hear about ones that are off the coast, but these are above water. Yes.
Oh, so Peter W. says, is the lit pillar a two-eye stone?
That is a very interesting
question.
Point. Yeah, there's something very, very unusual about the lit pillar. And the explanation of it is it's very dark down there and that this thing literally lights it up in like a city light. So it's quite remarkable. I think it was one of the most amazing finds. And it's also one of those things which obviously needed more research at the time. And this is what kills me whenever I read these, which is when you go back and you see the people who were trying to bring the Casey stories out. And the time just wasn't right for it. And also they were blocked at every turn. So, I mean, it's something that you look at and you say the culture could really be moved along on this question. I think it's quite ridiculous that we're still at a standstill when it comes to this. And a lot of those serious researchers who've been in the field for 20 or 30 years that I've spoken to, like Carmen or like Graham Hancock, they feel exactly the same way. Yes.
This is an intriguing question. I have no idea if you know this or not. Oh, so Kontiki Man wanted to know, have you looked into Sykes' connection to Hans Herberger and his cosmic ice theory, quote, moon capture, leading to the destruction of Atlantis?
There's an article in one of Sykes' journal by this person. But if you have additional information related to that, you can send it to info@darkjournalists.com and just put the subject matter all in caps, and I'll make sure to read it. But that is absolutely fascinating. The moon capture aspect is very interesting. It's something we'll definitely dive into on another show. There's a whole, there's a major anthroposophy Rudolf Steiner aspect talking exactly about moon capture, which I think is something that we could bring in for a show like that. Yes, Ms. Olivia.
Flow in Through wants to know, could the two-eye stone have operated in connection with group consciousness?
That's how it was operated. There's no doubt about it. Group sound also. Apparently, some of the chanting and things that we see left over in the Egyptian culture, that has an aspect to it. There's a sound technology and there's a consciousness raising technology having to do with that. Now what we have are the echoes of these ceremonies that took place and the initiation rites that took place. Remember, the Egyptian mystery schools, those are the roots of the mystery schools for us now. I mean, but they went back even further into Atlantean times, which are very, very hard for us to grasp. One of the Casey readings, when he was talking about this period of time, he said that you have to think about the consciousness of the average person, even in ancient Egyptian times, could sense what was going on above them a mile in the sky. So our consciousness is very different now. Those people were very much more connected naturally to the spiritual world. And this particular phase that humanity is going through seems, if anything, to be highly materialistic. And we need to break out of that, I think, to get a real sense. And this is what studying some of these ancient societies does, because even when you get into the Mayans and some of those offshoots of the Atlantean culture, the Inca, who Casey called the Incal, and said that they were known as Og, which is an outpost of Atlantis, that's important because we start to get an idea that later on, what we know as the Maya and the Inca, those are kind of cultures that are legacy cultures from this other far more powerful group. And that's what I think is important for us to keep in mind. By the time you get to the Aztecs, it's completely degraded into human sacrifice and all the rest of it. So you're seeing an intense degradation of a once high and mighty culture. And just look around you at the culture that we're in right now. We're getting a little bit of that degradation on a daily basis. But I do think it's important for us to see the larger picture with this, the way that Sykes was doing it. Another artifact in the Florida expedition comes from Marcos Island, which is on the western side of Florida. And this artifact, which looks very Egyptian and like Bast. Yes. Or
Bastet.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I think that there's no doubt we have to keep in mind that this is so different from what they find from the natives there. It's a whole entirely different world. So when we think about how these cultures came forward and how the Atlanteans fit into this picture, when they show up, they're incredibly advanced, dealing with what are basically a lot of savages. And so the savages will leave behind these artifacts like arrows and bows and things like that. And then the Atlantean ruins will be something like, the power station. So we have to be able to separate those in our minds so that when they go back and they say, well, we haven't really found evidence for this, so, it doesn't work. Well, there's an incredible story which is about these ruins that they find. And these were found actually in Iowa. Let me see if I can go into these here. And I have to say that when I looked at these and I went back into the story, the fact that they were rejected by archaeology, especially American archaeology, was a problem. One of the things I pointed out about Augustus Le Plongeon, now, Le Plongeon was somebody who really changed the entire way we understood Mexico and Central America. He's the one who dug up most of the important pyramids and all the rest. But he brought forward the fact he had interpreted and cracked the code of the Mayan hieroglyphs, which have still not been cracked even to this day. And most of those books that were burned when Cortez and these other groups from Spain came over, we lost all their history because they burned their books. But some of the books like Popol Vuh and stuff, they got a handle on. But some of the older Mayan hieroglyphs, they don't know how to read. They never got a Rosetta Stone for them. So Le Plongeon had actually deciphered and interpreted a lot of these. And he went to the American Archaeological Association, and they said, well, those savage Indians could never do that. They've never had an advanced language back there. And that was the end of it, because we had all these wars against the Indians and the Native Americans that were here. So they couldn't turn around and say, in this environment, well, we found out that they're actually a very advanced the antecedent of this culture is very advanced. That wouldn't look very good for them. So you can see there were a lot of political motivations to reject this. Now these actual tablets is very interesting. Bless you, Miss Livia.
Sorry
These
about
are
that.
the Davenport artifacts. And they have obvious Egyptian overtones to them. One of them depicts what's called the opening of the mouth ceremony in the Osiris literature. We'll take just a quick look. This was discovered in Iowa, and it's definitely Egyptian. And it was originally dated somewhere past 2000 BC. Now, but they try to hush it up. This is another piece of the Davenport Stela, and if you read it, archaeology still rejects this. They still will not go for it and decipher it or accept it as a piece of the Egyptians, basically.
What's your explanation for it?
They literally say that, they've used all kinds of things from, it was a hoax, to all these other things. But one of the things that they said was that one of these great travelers bought it in Egypt, came back here, and then dropped it in the woods somewhere, So they came up with so many different things for this not to fit in. So what we have to understand is the story of early America, which something Graham Hancock gets into in his book, the new book, America Before, is completely, we've lost that story. And we have all kinds of Egyptian artifacts in America. We have the Hotzone stories. We have the influence of the Atlantean culture coming in to America. And instead, what we get is this idea that it was basically, you had a bunch of savage tribes and that's it, which doesn't make any sense anyway, because when you look at all those advanced tribes, and one of the things that we got from the Iroquois is when we developed the Constitution, literally that whole group of tribes that forms this nation, they were basically the blueprint for the American Constitution. That's pretty advanced. If you look at the Sioux culture, they have that incredible book by Black Elk, which really describes their history. And I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is these are very advanced spiritually as well as in other ways. They had lost the ability to build, and the Atlanteans, because through the destruction of the Two-Eye Stone, couldn't operate the technology anymore. So this is how it went. Just like with us, if we had lost that knowledge through a nuclear war, we'd be back in the Stone Age to a certain degree. But there'd be certain echoes of a story back there of how advanced we were at a certain point when men acted like gods, and they really did. Yes.
Perfect segue for this question. Destination Lyra says, please explain how we degraded over millennia. It's a big question.
Well, what I think is interesting is there's a big shutout after the Egyptian culture goes down. And we get the mystery schools coming in through things like the Renaissance and giving us that. But then they really come in, according to Steiner and anthroposophy in 1840, they come head to head in a situation with scientific materialism really turning it on. And in Steiner's cosmology, these are Ahrimanic groups, Ahriman. And the Ahriman influence is all materialism. So when we get to that juncture, when we get to that point, it's quite fascinating because what happens is the mystery schools who've held all this mystery information, like reincarnation, like psychic experience, like UFOs, like life after death, all of these different aspects, they decide we have to let this stuff out. Oddly enough, we're in a jam and some of the groups say, no, we can't do that. And other groups say, yes, we have to do it. And the groups that say, yes, we have to do it, their reasoning is we have to do it because we're not going to recognize humanity shortly. Give it another 100 years and these won't even they'll be completely devoid of their spiritual understanding. And this is how it was working. So the mystery schools decided to let groups like Helena Blavatsky and Theosophy come forward with their blessing. And there were problems with that, of course, as well. But they also tried other things, and some of that early efforts of like the Fox sisters to bring the idea of life after death and of spirit communication and the incredible spiritual craze of spiritualism in 1850s and 1860s in America. That's all the mystery school influence trying. And what they decide by 1875 is that Blavatsky is the compromised character and that they can do this through Helena Blavatsky. I do think it's a fascinating story, and I feel like Blavatsky is the key figure, but what happens is Blavatsky becomes somebody that they can't control. And so what they try to do is kind of take her off course, and it gets kind of ugly, as we've described in a few stories. But I think this idea that the mystery schools are trying to help the civilization move forward, and that what comes out of Theosophy is that Annie Besant is leading Theosophy, and she goes to Germany and she finds Rudolf Steiner. And it's Rudolf Steiner who brings us the Western initiation tradition as Theosophy goes off into the Eastern tradition. And it's that Western initiation tradition that we need so badly in the 21st century. So I think anthroposophy is that public mystery school that helped us do it. And I think that when we look at the work of Steiner, I'm not sure that we have a very good representation out there in the world. But, like we have the Waldorf schools, which are under attack because there's so many Waldorf ideas for promoting early childhood education that go against popular social norms, and like excessive vaccines and all the rest of it. So now they're like targeting Steiner's work. If you look at in Britain in particular, we're getting some heavy responses to it. But it started here. There was a New York Times editorial on Waldorf schools. So yeah, it's getting pretty heavy. This is the time, though, I think, where these things come together, and the mystery schools have kind of let the information out to a certain degree for us to get our hands on. It's just enough of a tool for us to battle this intense transhumanistic scientific materialism, which is being rammed down everyone's throat. And the way that I look at that is they're desperate to make it happen fast on their side. This kind of making the society transhumanistic and forgetting their spirituality and kind of taking it over a cliff. And that they in that speed to make things happen, they might be making mistakes. And so on our side of things, we have to take advantage of those mistakes. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. You can go to the darkjournalist.com website and sign up for our newsletter now. This is the only guaranteed way for us to stay in touch with each other. And it's so crucial that we do, especially with the incredible crackdown that we've seen on so many different channels that, I've found a lot of different channels have been censored or shadow banned. And you were saying you weren't picking up, who was it, Cheryl Atkinson in your...
Yes.
Yeah, because she does so much work on
and
vaccines. WikiLeaks, right? They've been, forget it. I never see a WikiLeaks tweet anymore. So that's very easy, right? You don't like what somebody says, you just shut them off. And that's what communist China has. And that's what Twitter and Facebook emulate, because their idea of a society is the control that China has over their people. So China is not a very good model for advancement of culture at all. It's a dictatorship. It's a communist dictatorship. And now they're utilizing, capitalist corporate America to recreate America in China and then create a social credit system, enslave their society, and bring that over here. So all that has to be rejected. And I don't find that the imports that we're getting from China in terms of intellectually, it's not very advanced at all. If anything, I think China needs a complete revolution from the inside, and they need to throw out a lot of that corporate influence. We have to remember that in China, one of the things when Apple's building the laptops and stuff over there is they build these incredible suicide nets for the workers that they have working 12 to 16 hours a day. And those people get so depressed, they jump out the window. So their solution wasn't to give them psychological help. It was to build nets so that when they jumped out, they didn't kill themselves. You go down there, you grab the guy, you let him rest for a little while, you send him back to work. So that's their mentality. It's a real slave driver mentality. And, it might as well, it's kind of like a, sort of a lesser version of Auschwitz in a sense. So that's not where the culture needs to go. That's what the corporations are set up around, and they've allowed their greed to get ahead of their sensibilities, because it's not in their best interest to create a culture like that. And in America, it's going to really backfire, because Americans still have a sense of what it is to be a powerful middle-class citizenry.
We barely.
Yes. Well, it's still there. It's hard. They're trying to get rid of it and just be like, hey, you're going to have driverless cars and robot bartenders, and just forget about
right. And universal basic income. So you can stay home, smoke pot, practice guitar, this is.
Yeah, but that's always spooky, isn't it? Whenever they make it sound that easy, you're like, what are they going to do actually with those people?
Nothing is free.
Well, let's think of it this way. What did they do in California? PG&E, right? All our friends in California, they've shut off your power. So that's how the corporations think. And all the articles defending it were absurd. Any of the articles should have been, this was an absurd move, and PGE should be, the citizenry should be outraged by this. But instead, all the newspapers, and I was reading them from Reuters and all the rest of it, it was crazy. New York Times, Washington Post, Reuters, Wall Street Journal, they were all like, well, as a result of climate change, this is the penalty that we no, that's just you shutting off the power. It's got nothing to do with climate change. And climate change and the issues from climate change are largely caused by the polluters, which are the corporations in the first place. So it's those guys who have to pay for it and those guys who have to clean it up. And if you, Apple, are sitting on $25 billion and not using it, well, use it to clean up the environment. I mean, it's
right. And I'll tell you, if the Democrats actually made this their platform,
they'd get a lot. They would.
Yeah.
Or a third party.
Absolutely.
Or a third party. It's amazing to me that doesn't happen. No, I think what we're seeing is both sides cozying up to the corporate dictatorship.
And people are waking up to it.
But with Olivia out there, she's really going to be driving the train.
So since you were just talking about China, could I ask you a question?
Yes, you can. Actually, let me finish this thing about the newsletter.
Okay.
Do sign up for the newsletter. Go there now. Sign up. Make sure that you get it. We'll send it to you once a week. It'll have new events in it. It'll have all the things that we have coming up, which will be explosive. And you have to be on that newsletter to get it. The newsletter is free, but you have to be signed up for it. Now, while you're there at the darkjournalist.com website, subscribe. We've made it incredibly easy to subscribe and support this show. So get behind the work, and if you've got the link, Miss Olivia, you can put that up to make sure that you take a role in this, and don't be a passive bystander. Get behind the work that we're doing here. I've had these conversations with people about how they make a difference, and really contributing to the show is a great asset. Subscribing to the show helps quite a lot. Spread the links, spread the ideas, help people understand it. Yes.
So each show gets ultimately like a minimum of 30,000 views generally, and there are some that are over 200,000. And if we had everyone who watched just actually contribute $1, $2, $5, we could have a conference. We could have a forum. There are so many things that we could fund.
That's true. And it's a really good point. One of the things that I'll point out there also is, when it comes down to it, well, if you do it actually, because Tesla Trump in the time capsule has 400,000 views.
Oh, God.
Think of it that way. No, but it is. And the best thing to do, though, really is subscribe to the show because it is that affordable. And you want to make sure that you're on the inside for that. This is the good time to do it. I highly recommend it. And from our point of view, we're going to be reinvesting that time and energy into getting you these quality shows, these quality events, which we have some very powerful things coming up just for you. And so we do appreciate the support. It's incredible for the people who do support us and who do subscribe or super chat or whatever. It makes a huge difference, and we really appreciate it. So thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to jump into this section dealing with the Akhenaten aspect. But before I do, we can actually start taking questions. If you have them all in caps, that's good. So I'll take a few more questions from you.
Okay, well, we were talking about China. So
yes.
Leagog wanted to know, where does China fit into the Atlantis stories? And Danielle Jorgensen, who was the archaeology student, said China has more pyramids than Egypt.
It's true. Oh, it's incredible. I mean, and China fits in so much with these stories. And they found these incredible red-headed mummies in China. And, it's amazing the things that China and the Chinese people have been through. If you think about things like Mao's revolution and, the slaughter of all these farmers and the people who are close to the land, they've been through this. They understand so much. The culture is an incredible culture. It's the leadership, again, that's corrupt. And we've seen a lot of that even in our own country and other countries. But when it comes to the ancient aspects of China, forget it. They are completely off the charts. We have this whole thing about red-headed mummies and those very, very tall mummies, which reminds me of a story that Carmen told me in relation to Egypt, that she was shown a sarcophagus of a giant, basically, and that everyone who had seen it was like, yeah, deal with that. But this was not a public thing. I do find these stories very, very interesting because it suggests, again, there are aspects to that evolutionary story that they don't want us knowing either. And that's crucial. That's how you control things. When you control the narrative, you control the history around it. But China, incredibly powerful archaeology in relation to that. And that would be, again, now largely the Lemurian civilization, which was in the Pacific. And when that broke off, it broke two ways. Half of the people went running off to South America. The other half went running off to China and Asia. And the echoes of Lemuria basically being what they call the motherland, Mu, and a lot of what we have in terms of Hawaiian lore and lore in Australia, that all comes from that central culture of Mu. And much of, I think, Easter Island, that would be part of that. It's interesting because Lemuria comes in before Atlantis. So it's a pre-Atlantis move. And it's referred to as Mu in the literature and in the Casey readings. I think when we're looking at is basically the Pacific version of Atlantis. But when Blavatsky talks about it from a theosophical angle, she says that they are, it's basically incredibly psychic, and that what's going on there is that the Atlanteans, when they show up, they're the next generation of the psychic, incredibly in tune group. So, but the first version is this almost etheric group that operates in Lemuria, and that's very early humanity. And one of the weird things, one of the weird echoes of that period that we hear in Steiner's readings is that Steiner is telling us that the Lemurians in the beginning, the women were dominant because they had memory. And I think this is very important. And it's a crucial thing to keep in mind, which is that the men had instinct, but they didn't have memory. And so the men had will. And this gave women that incredible leadership ability. And I think very often we see that women have incredible memory in relation to men.
I have a crap memory. You have a spectacular memory.
I see this over and over again. But I do, with my memory, it's just, it's always there and it's always working. Mm-hmm. But I do find this interesting when we look at those earlier cultures, because we have earlier echoes. And when you look at things like Alaska, where they have totems and stuff like that, that all is Lemurian. And it echoes this idea of the Chinese, just like they have that idea that in the Eskimos had something to do with those earlier cultures. And one of the things I think that we need to keep in mind with the early cultures is there are centers. And Egypt being the most well-known, most advanced center. Why? Because the most advanced Atlantean people went to Egypt. Now, some of them also went to Ireland, and others went to South and Central America. So we have to see, when we're looking at the Hotzone, that survives a little bit longer after Atlantis goes down. That strip of Bimini Murius shows up in all those Celtic legends. And so we're getting a hint there that a lot of the magic that we're hearing about in the Celtic legends, in the Druids, in the Cauldron of Dagda, where they can make a potion that will make men come back to life, and they can see the future and all that. And in the story of the Tuatha De Danann, we are seeing, that they can float, they can resurrect the dead. They're a small group that when they show up, they can beat any army. They're very persuasive. They're large. They glow. I mean, this is an echo of these very advanced groups that came out of Atlantis. And I think that we're starting to get a picture there, like a full picture around that. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Well, Truth Flower just said to me, yes. Your memory is quap because you're juggling with so many past lives. I actually think that might be true.
Isn't that fascinating?
I feel much kinder to myself right now. It's true. I do so much personal shadow work that, trying to heal and enlighten myself. I think that's a good explanation.
Well,
I'm going to take it.
I've never found your memory to be anything but sharp. Awful. But I think that's a good explanation. So in relation to all this, we were talking last week about Lindbergh, and I got some great feedback from everyone. One of the things that I wanted to show in relation to Lindbergh is somebody named Lester Hendershot, because Lester Hendershot comes up in a Casey reading, and he is someone who Lindbergh was a proponent of. Lindbergh at the time was doing a lot of aerial archaeology work, which I found fascinating, going over the Hotzone and taking very interesting photos. The name of this article from the Archaeological Conservatory is Charles Lindbergh's Little Known Passion. And it is 1927, an obscure U.S. airmail pilot named Charles A. Lindbergh, that's A for Augustus, completed his first solo transatlantic flight, achieving worldwide fame. Virtually everyone knows about Lucky Lindy's historic flight. In the spirit of St. Louis, Lindbergh was also a pioneer in the field of aerial archaeology. This is very important because he's one of the first. And we know from everything that we were talking about with his presence in the Hotzone, that he, like Howard Hughes, like Ernest Hemingway, they all form this group that centers around the Hotzone. And then their work there comes up over and over again. Atlantis, Bimini. In the case of Hemingway, the close relationship with the Caseys, them living on Bimini, the brother founding the new Atlantis. Now, one thing, when I was looking at Lester Hemingway's founding of the New Atlantis and going through his Republic of New Atlantis details, is something came up that I hadn't seen before, and it was called an ocean bank, which is something he founded in relation to this. This is quite fascinating when people have spoken to me about, how do you get these lots? And it may be associated, these lots in the Atlantic Ocean where you think Atlantis is going to come up. It may be associated, in fact, with being part of a business enterprise or entity. So I'm going to read a little bit from this, which is a lot of his work for New Atlantis. Lester Hemingway, who was the brother of Ernest Hemingway, he has left behind a lot of information relating to this culture he was trying to found. Interestingly enough, when he did a stamp that bore the resemblance of Lyndon Johnson on it, he got a thank you note from Lyndon Johnson directly, which I also found was very interesting, because the Kennedys were so aware of what was happening there in the Hotzone, as we've discussed in many previous episodes. Okay, so coming up to this section, the Republic of New Atlantis may seem a little more than tomfoolery, says the official kind of repository of this at the University of Texas. But several elements of Lester's plan hold a superficial plausibility in the 1960s, a decade that saw something of a boomlet and self-proclaimed island nations, some on man-made platforms. The Republic of New Atlantis was born with several advantages. Most importantly, the Jamaican government did not seem to oppose the project, perhaps because Lester Hemingway had the foresight to prohibit gambling in his new nation, and because one of the Republic's stated purposes was raising money to protect fishing resources in the area. In September 1964, a spokesman for the Jamaican embassy in Washington told the New York Herald Tribune that Lester was a decent, well-meaning soul and described the project as good and sound for humanity. Additionally, the ocean bank chosen as the site for Atlantis, New Atlantis, was in international waters and did not lie on a continental shelf, which eliminated several legal objections to the project. The mere fact that Lester received a thank you note from the White House and addressed to him as the acting president of New Atlantis made it the closest a dreamer has come to official recognition, according to a 1988 interview given by the director of the U.S. Office of the Geographer. We can see a lot of people were on board with this idea, and the White House is sending him a message as the president of New Atlantis, just in case. They had heard the Casey prophecy at the time, too, about the Poseidon Temple, and they knew about Hemingway's activities down there, or his brother's activities. So we have a very, very strange case there. And then, of course, what happens in 1968 is they tell him, you got to close that down. You've got to get out of there, and if you don't, we'll recognize you as a hostile. And so New Atlantis goes up in flames. But nonetheless, giving us that edge, that idea, and saying that they were going to found their own constitution, etc. It gives us an idea that Lester Hemingway was really in on this. Now, I'm going to jump to something from Lindbergh and Lester Hendershot, which I didn't get to last week, and then we're going to take your questions. So make sure to ask them all in caps. We're already getting good questions. Now, what's interesting is a quick story about Lester Hendershot. So in some Casey readings, they talk about a perpetual motion motor, and this is in 1928. And he gives all these instructions about how to set one up. Now, interestingly enough, I think there is probably one or two reasons why this reading mentions this motor. People were coming to him, and it was very much in this thing where new energy and the idea of new energy wasn't really totally clamped down yet. And so if they could get a new breakthrough energy source, they were going for it. And so there were people who were like, hey, I have a magnetic motor, whatever it was. Lester Hendershot was one of them. I'm going to introduce him here because we're going to do an entire episode on him coming up when we're doing this breakthrough energy episode. Quote, Lester Hendershot. History tells us it was Tesla, a co-worker to Thomas Edison, who later went on to help Westinghouse become a major energy supplier, was the first person to visualize just what magnetic power would do. But it took Lester Hendershot to put that application into practical use. What's so captivating is there really is no mention of Hendershot meeting with Charles Lindbergh. This is a meeting that enabled the Spirit of St. Louis to make that historic flight, but it was after Lindbergh's historic flight that history never has told the real truth. Now, Lindbergh actually paid Hendershot to develop his magnetic motor, and he took it before Washington and tried to get all these people on board with it. But this entire thing about Hendershot suggests that it was his work that got the Spirit of St. Louis across, and this may very well actually even be true. Now, to purposely hide the facts behind the engine that was in the Spirit of St. Louis on its record flight from New York to Paris, history books fail to mention that Hendershot was in close contact with Charles Lindbergh. Lester Hendershot was the one who designed the first practical magnetic generator motor and compensated for much of the fuel that was needed for Lucky Lindy to succeed. A little background. Who was Lester Hendershot? Not too much is really known about this man. The inventor of the Hendershot fuelless generator. Back in 1927, it's said that during the 1920s, he was working on a new type of aviation compass. While devising this aviation compass, he stumbled across a method of generating energy in the process, and thus came into being the first and only actually working magnetic motor. Now, this is fascinating for a lot of reasons, but a lot of the things we went into in terms of Lindbergh and the advanced technology he was associated with von Braun and others later, and even taking a major role in the Apollo program. So the setup there with Hendershot and his close relationship with Lindbergh is going to become something important. I wanted to give everyone a sneak preview of that. We have to also bear in mind that there are some surprises to come out in relation to Lindbergh and some of the things we've discovered about him and also about Buzz Aldrin as we covered in the episode. And with that, Miss Olivia, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, so it's question time?
It is. I'm going to save the Akhenaten section because we get Carmen Bolter back. That's what we're going to want to talk about with her.
The chat has been incredible tonight.
Fantastic.
And really spiritual, and I have not been able to keep up with everything. So
remember, the chat is
the ideas room.
It is the ideas room. Let me tell you something. There's incredible people in the ideas room, and calling it a chat at the end of the day isn't going to cut it because there's so many creative, interesting minds in there. It has to be the ideas room. That also, you can knock those around. In terms of just transferring those ideas and playing ping pong with different subjects. Over and over again, I've seen things come out in there that are way beyond any other group of people getting together online. So
incredibly knowledgeable.
The ideas room is really It's where it's at. And I really appreciate the kind of questions that come out of there. Yes,
Okay,
Miss Olivia.
so forgive me if we go over territory you already covered because I haven't been able to keep up. Kathy Ashby wants to know, are there pyramids under the Everglades?
Well, according to J. Manson Valentine and his letters, now I have gone over those letters, and I even called the museum where they came from. It's a very strange story, and I went into it in depth 2 episodes ago, which, J. Manson Valentine and this very mysterious person named Michael Hudson, which is probably a pseudonym, they were exploring these pyramids, and a person from the museum went with them to confirm it. And they had found some in the Everglades, and they figured out from their measurements that it went 65 feet down. But what's interesting is that Manson Valentine suggested that there was a wall that was over a mile long close by related to this. So we have a whole kind of ancient archaeology structure there, far beyond anything that they attribute to the natural Native American cultures that were there later. Just like what we found with Bloomfield Moore's exploration of those Putnam ruins and the incredible two-eye stone representations. These are Atlantean echoes. One of the things I did find mentioning that is this a picture of those pyramids off of the Florida coast and underwater. I know I had those here earlier, and if I find them again, I'm going to show them. But keep going, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so Shamanis Anam Kara. Ancient sculptures created by laser technology or higher in Atlantis, like the crop circles?
There's no question. It's good to mention things like crop circles because we don't understand the technology that gets them there. And obviously, it's a deep, significant message, and I'm not talking about the ones that are imitative, but we know from enough good researchers that there's a real phenomena that takes place there. Oddly enough, very often seen in relation to UFO activity. So you have to wonder about the correlations there. But I think what you're getting at is interesting because when we think about Atlantean technology, they're operating on a level of psychic manifestation that it's hard for us to imagine. But on some level, we have the same ability, even though the conditions on the Earth are different. So I think there is a very major link between the modern occurrence of this crop circle phenomena. And I don't think I've never been satisfied with any of the answers around the phenomena as it stands. It's always disturbed me that we never got further with the answers and that there was such a blowback against it. Anyone I know who goes deeply into these subjects believes that there was something very special going on in relation to crop zones, particularly in England. I mean, there's no doubt about it that that's where the major ones are. Yes.
7 synesthesia. Could Tesla have been tapping into Atlantean tech? Do we know if he was aware?
Well, what's interesting, and we would know, he actually got a reading from Edgar Cayce, as did Thomas Edison. Both are not included in the archives because for one reason or another, they were lost or they were deemed that they couldn't be let out publicly. And this has only happened on a few occasions. One of the other readings that we lost is the follow-up reading after the Bimini Poseidia connection is introduced. And I've mentioned this, that the businessmen who did the interview and got the reading with Cayce and took him to Bimini, actually, into the Hotzone, where he really sized up the situation. Those readings are there. The follow-up readings, after he mentions the Temple of Poseidia being off the coast, they disappeared, and that's very rare because the ARE was already established, and he already had, they always kept copies. And there's notes. If you look in those Cayce readings, if you look at the notes associated with the Bimini readings, there's a huge kerfuffle in there about they don't know what happened to the other one, but it's obviously they're suggesting that it was stolen, and I believe it was the businessmen who stole it. And I'm fond of telling the story of Cayce goes back to New York and he's giving a lecture coming up from Virginia Beach, and those same businessmen show up, and he's like, "Oh, there they are." They had disappeared basically off the map, and he's like, "They must be I'm gonna look for them after the lecture because I want to talk to those guys to see what they wound up doing with Bimini. And then at the end of the lecture, he goes down there and they're gone. So they were just tuning in. They were getting in there to see, is he talking about our stuff? So it's quite fascinating. Yes.
Thomas Schroeder says Tesla was given Vatican library documents. Have you heard that?
Yeah, I've heard that too. And they say it was through his father, but I don't know if that's confirmed, honestly, because Dr. Farrell told me that the Vatican wouldn't have been friendly because of the nature of his dad's religious standing. So I don't know. I don't know if that's verified. Tesla, obviously, there is some kind of Atlantean connection with him. I believe it's a past life connection that he had to it, but he has to be looked at as the most extraordinary inventor. And had we been living in his paradigm as opposed to Edison's, we wouldn't have needed all those Middle Eastern wars. We wouldn't need all these energy crises. We wouldn't be in the situation that we're in today with people screaming about climate change and trying to get the public to pay for the sins of the corporations. So I think this is very, very important that we get a proper picture of Tesla. And
what is that incredible video that we've seen, the rap? The Edison Tesla rap.
Oh, well, everyone knows that one. That's classic.
That's great.
Rap battles of history.
There you go.
Yeah, that one's really exceptional. I think they did their best work on that. And finally.
That makes me cry every time. I know it's funny, but it's so true.
Yes, I can definitely appreciate it. Well, I have to say, when it comes to Tesla, what's funny is actually, my dad used to tell me in relation to Tesla that in the 50s and 60s, no one talked about him at all. It wasn't really till the 1970s that he got rediscovered. And we know about, and we've done a lot of research on the incredible oddity, mystery of the fact that scientist John Trump, who was Donald Trump's uncle, was sent in to work with Tesla's papers after the fact of him dying to find if there was this mysterious device that could basically take UFOs down. And it's a very strange story when you get into it. And when you think of that type of battle taking place and who's in the White House now, it really makes you stop and wonder. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X Series 69. This is Egyptian Mysteries in the Hotzone. And we are going to get Dr. Carmen Bolter back. She had a lot of problems coming in through the Hotzone. She was down there with the film crew doing some exciting work. And we definitely plan to have her back. But in the meantime, we've been diving deep into people like Egerton Sykes and these incredible Atlantis researchers. And I think one of the things that we have to get on board with is that it's land rising. It's Atlantis rising, but it's land rising off the East Coast is the message from the mystery schools. It's the message from the Casey readings. And we've seen from Ernest Hemingway to his brother founding the new Atlantis there in Jamaica, close to the Hotzone, and John Lennon buying these islands and them selling these lots in the ocean in anticipation of Atlantis rising. This is a very important subject that's going to become progressively more important as it gets revealed. But the mystery schools and people like Casey have given us that snapshot that this is coming. And so if we get on board with it now, it's something that's going to be very important in terms of the larger picture and moving the culture into this consciousness of understanding this incredibly high spiritual civilization that destroyed itself, and how that has a mirror effect on us now. And how important these artifacts have been, really spawning these incredible geopolitical battles over time there in the Hotzone. And whenever you get to Cuba, it's particularly hardcore. And that's why we have so many sanctions going on there now. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Audrey Harris, what about the Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon? A lot of people want to know about that.
Well, there's a fundamental story about the Smithsonian, and the Smithsonian is known to suppress certain types of information. There's a great Rockefeller role in this too, because the Rockefellers controlled archaeology and were deep in on it through the American Archaeological Association and others. if you needed money for a major dig, you had to go to the Rockefellers. They were the final controllers. The Smithsonian is an interesting situation because they wanted to control, and again, just like with when we were looking at Augustus Le Plongeon, who was like, hey, look, I've discovered the Mayan hieroglyphs. I know the key. It's just like the Rosetta Stone. And they said, we don't want to talk about that because, we're at war with the Native Americans and we can't introduce the fact that they're in this incredibly advanced culture. So, it's kind of interesting when we look at it that way. Now, this particular thing about the Grand Canyon Egyptian find was listed in a lot of newspapers at the time, I think about 1913, somewhere in there. And they talked about who came down, the scientists who came down to inspect the ruins, and they had drawings of some of these. It is that story that echoes, and then it was smothered, and the artifacts disappeared and all the rest of it. Now, when I was looking at stories in relation to the Hotzone, I found it over and over again the same thing was happening. So we have to understand that that type of history is always suppressed. Now, I've got a story here. It's the Andrew Collins story about these finds, this person who claimed to find all of these ruins off of Bimini, again, pyramids and all the rest of it. And he called a press conference, and he was somebody who actually had, this type of ability to really make a big difference. And this person had kind of credentials, and you wouldn't think he was somebody to just put on the story. So I'm going to read a little bit of this. The guy's name is Duvall, but this is Andrew Collins' story. So they were literally referred to as Atlantean temples being found off the coast of Florida. And I'll get through this quickly. On Labor Day 1968, an underwater archaeologist and zoologist associated with the University of Miami named J. Manson Valentine believed he had identified man-made structures of enormous size in shallow waters northwest of Bimini, a tiny Bahamas island about 55 miles off the Florida coast. So we all know the story. This is what happened there. The site became known as the Bimini Road and was extensively investigated during the 1970s by a research team led by ancient mysteries writer David Zink, who we covered earlier. Although Manson Valentine, Zink, and other primary researchers in this field, such as Dmitry Rybakov, became convinced that the stone causeway was man-made, oceanographic archaeologists and geologists tried to dismiss their findings. Since the 1970s, many more examples of inexplicable stone structures have been detected in the clear blue waters off the Great Bahama Bank, which stretches between Bimini in the north and the right-hand shoulder of South America. So that's part of the 3/4 of the Hotzone. It claimed, now, such was the situation on June 21st, 1997. This is an interesting story. In June of 1997, a curious email was posted to certain press agencies and newspapers across the United States. It claimed that irrefutable evidence of antediluvian temples had been discovered off the coast of Bimini. All was to be revealed at a press conference to be organized on July 25th by one Aaron Duvall, the author of the email and the president of a local Egyptological society, at the Miami Museum of Science. In subsequent releases dispatched between July 6th and the 15th to the same sources, tantalizing details of the alleged discoveries were outlined by Duvall. The so-called ancient Bimini temples, or Scott stones, named after the alleged discoverer, were said to have been constructed of huge blocks of stone, each around 6 feet in thickness and ranging in length from 9 to 12 feet. It's pretty major. These came in 3 different colors, red, white, and black, bringing to mind the multicolored walls that Plato, the Greek poet and philosopher, spoke of in his classic account of the fabled city of Atlantis. Further linking of the Bimini temples with Atlantis was Duvall's claim that the walls were coated in 3 different types of metal, revealed as brass, copper, and iron. Remember the iron, the copper 2-eye stone representation found in Florida I showed earlier from Bloomfield Moore. Now, Duvall linked the alleged site with ancient Egypt, claiming that casing stones like those that originally covered the Great Pyramid had been found on the site. Furthermore, he spoke of the presence of boreholes similar to examples present in the bedrock besides some of the unfinished obelisks to be seen in the famous quarries at Aswan in Egypt. So in addition to these features, Duvall stated that the Scott stones, as they're called, possessed orbital plots of the planets and what seemed to have been intricate star shafts or sky maps, which recorded the paths of heavenly bodies, particularly Saturn and Jupiter. Now, this is a pretty heavy-duty story. There's a lot that goes with this, and a lot of these people who got on board with it believed Duvall, and Duvall had great coordinates and great understanding of the area, and he had archaeological credentials. Now, he was basically spooked, but he had first contacted all these people like Collins who decided they were going to show up and had already spent the money to take the flight ticket to go see him. And what happens is in the 2 weeks between when he contacts everyone about these and they take him seriously because of his credentials, the Scott stones, basically the entire story, like the Zelitsky story, gets moved off the front pages. But Duvall himself finds himself in an unusual position of saying, I want to take everyone to where it is, but I'm trying to basically do it in such a way that we can secure the area. And so he locks himself in a conundrum. And just like the story I mentioned earlier with the Sphinx at the beginning, we're looking at these stories where it comes out and it doesn't get blocked. And so they can't block the story in like the New York Times and the Washington Post. Even they had to print the Zelitsky story. This story also got out ahead of everybody because he went right to the archaeological community who were on the alternative side. So it was getting out. The word was getting out.
So where is that?
It's off the coast of Florida near Bimini.
Okay.
Yeah, It's another one. And it's 1997 that this takes place. The whole story, the upshot is the entire story gets shut down and Duvall can't come out. He's either been threatened or warned. Remember, in the case of Paulina Zelitsky, after the Cuban Navy, after they decided they didn't need her anymore, and they sort of got her out of there from researching those ruins, later she'd find herself in a Mexican prison for a short stay when they were trying to intimidate her. So we have to think about, we talk about this with alternative energy developers and people who do breakthrough energy, and this is what happened to them. This guy's lab burned down, he was threatened, and so on and so forth. But what happens when you get into the hot zone and you really find something? There's a whole X-Protect mechanism going on there. If you think that the UFO X-Protect mechanism is tough, try dealing with this. Try showing up in a Mexican prison for finding ruins. So this story gets shut down again and again, and Collins himself found the story very convincing and was absolutely shocked that the Scott stones were just kind of taken out, as a story, and that he couldn't get any more follow-up. I'll leave you with a couple of quick things about the Scott stones, and we will go deeper with those at a certain point. This is Collins again. There was the question of the location of the so-called Scott stones. On being asked whether he would use a boat or plane to reach the site, he refused point blank to answer, even getting up on one occasion with the words, "I know what you're trying to do," i.e. wheedle the location out of him. Add this to his claim that he often visited the Scott stones, and it implied that they easily were accessible to him, perhaps even in the vicinity of Miami itself. More significantly, on being prompted as to their position, he would say only that some of the stones were in shallow waters and some were at the low tide mark, while still others were permanently on display above the waterline. This is an incredible find, and we go round and round with this, and the upshot is there is no way for us to get our hands on the Scott stones because Duvall went underground and never resurfaced after having been basically out in the public eye for decades. So I think the way that we look at this is very important. The shutdown of information, the shutdown of knowledge for humanity in the hot zone is heavy duty. And so having a group like us taking a look at the hot zone in earnest and with the support of other people who are down there and looking at these things, it can make really a difference to the entire story, because there's no way that if Duvall had discovered that, say now, instead of in 1997, with our program, it would have been right dead center. And so he never would have gone underground and all the rest of it. They never would have been able to threaten him out. Probably the same thing with Paulina Zelitsky's work. So we have to think about how this formulation of our understanding of the Hotzone and the information that we just happen to have in relation to this and the great history that we've set up through the series, we have a foundation now to get our hands, I think, on this very, very important story. Yes, Miss Olivia.
TJ Liberty-Bell. Why aren't the Azores a more likely place for Atlantis? It's right over the mid-Atlantic rift.
No, you're absolutely right. And the Azores are mentioned by Edgar Cayce, but that's the other side. Basically, Atlantis, as we understand it, stretched from the Gulf of Mexico on one side and the Mediterranean on the other. So it's one huge continent. It's like America, but sitting in the Atlantic Ocean. So Plato described it that way too. He said it's beyond the Straits of Heracles and it goes out to another continent. So when we look at it that way, the underwater ruins, there's a lot of work by Egerton, Sykes, and others looking at the underwater ruins, and all that's coming to fruition now, because if you see a lot of the underwater finds and people who claim underwater pyramids, well, I've been finding stuff in Florida and Bimini and all the rest of that, which is incredibly important, but there's a lot of finds off Spain. And we have people in, some of those ruins and things that are coming out fast and heavy. And you might think even that it's, the Hotzone might be tougher in some ways because those waters around Spain, apparently they have pretty easy access. So I think there's a lot to be said about ruins in the Azores. Casey talked about the Azores and also the Canary Islands in terms of destinations for the Atlanteans, and also the Basque up in the Pyrenees. Mm-hmm. So yes.
Right. With that language that isn't related to anyone else's language. They don't know where it came from.
It's incredible. It really is remarkable. And whenever we have Alexandra on the show, mm-hmm. she has such great knowledge, history of the Basque. She studied them. And she talking about their language and how exclusive it is and how unusual they are for that region. Not to generalize, but certainly they are. Yes.
Okay. So Esoteric 369 Wall. How about the Egyptian relics in caves in Cairo, Illinois, which has the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers?
Yeah.
Also known as the Future City. And Wendy Eder said, Southern Illinois is known as Little Egypt. There were supposed to be Egyptian artifacts found in caves there. Have you heard of this?
Absolutely. And it is fascinating because when we get into, this is really Atlantis in America when you get to it. But what I found, which is so interesting to me, is that Sykes pointed directly to an Isis temple in the Hotzone that he had seen underwater. And he wouldn't identify the location, just like this Duvall guy. It makes me wonder if they all know the same place. But I do feel like when you look at these stories about the Grand Canyon, about Illinois, certainly we've seen it in relation, even the Mormon story, when you get right down to it, is quite unusual. In upstate New York, they find these unusual tablets, and that's where the whole Mormon religion comes from. And they say, hey, we were one of the lost tribes. We came over and landed in Mexico. And the Mormons themselves do extensive archaeological research through Brigham Young, trying to find support for this kind of wild history of the Mormons. So it is, like, the history is so deep in America and has been so suppressed. It's absurd when you think about it, because we have the Native American traditions, okay, but when you really go deeper on that, what are they talking about? They tell us about a much richer history, and we have this kind of really banal version of it through traditional archaeology, which in many ways was blown away by Graham Hancock's America Before book. But I like those stories of Egypt and America. You can feel that there's some resonance there, especially when you think about that Native American culture coming through. This is the shot. This went around for a while. This guy put up coordinates, and I decided to go on Google Earth and check them out. And that is where, we're seeing these. This is interesting. We'll get kind of close on this. Those are supposed to be 2 pyramids off the coast of Florida. And I have to say, it's quite compelling when looking at it. And for a little while, these were getting some notice and some attention, but I think we're going to hear more about these, and I'd like to see them investigated because I think they're a really good snapshot of some of this earlier archaeology there. We started the program off with this, which is another story like the Duvall story, which disappeared after 2014. And it's kind of compelling when you look at it. It's one of those that's hard to brush off. It's not a hoax. Whatever it was that was going on, they were looking at something. And I feel it's another suppressed story. And I'm telling you, I'm running into them the more that I research the Hotzone over and over again, where somebody has found something very major. Now, you might say traditionally, well, somebody could have made a mistake or whatever it happens to be. Even the story of Gordon Cooper and all of his activities from space, looking at the Hotzone, memorizing the coordinates, starts to come alive in the story of this. And I told you that they made, on the Discovery Channel, this thing called Gordon's Treasures, I think it's called. And they have this treasure hunter going down there and looking at these things, and they oriented the whole thing around Spanish galleons. And I feel like the Spanish galleon thing is just a code, because that's all that they feel free to talk about in relation to this. What he's actually looking at is, and the reason I think he was excited about it and kept a map in his head about it, is because he was up there and his instructions were to look directly in the Hotzone from space. Now, the story is that Kennedy sent him up there, and it was, you need to look for nuclear things or whatever. But they had the U-2 doing that, so that story doesn't make any sense. But from his vantage point, doing those flights in space, looking down at Earth, directly over the Hotzone, he's looking for those ruins. He's doing exactly the same thing, in my opinion, that we have those ships going back and forth with Hemingway looking down. And he's saying, I'm looking for German U-boats, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So, I think these things start to add up the more that we look at them. And we're starting to get here a much richer picture. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so Jim DiGiulio, were the Atlanteans giants? Haven't they found the North American mounds to contain remnants of giants? And did Casey say Atlanteans were giants too?
He does talk about giants in relation to these early cultures, but it's a very unusual story. And of course, we've seen this echo of giants over and over again. And I do feel that the way that Casey describes it, he echoes a biblical text, which is right around the Enoch section, where they talk about the sons of God and the daughters of man, and that this produced giants. This is what the Casey readings go back to. And when they talk about sons of God, though, this is quite interesting because it sounds to me like they're describing the advanced Atlanteans, sort of interrelating with a tribe. And something about their genes are so different from the traditional people that are around them that when they mix with them, they produced these offshoots that were giants. Now, the giants apparently, if you look at the echoes in the legends, became kind of a menace. And in the Bible, the way they talk about it is kind of like the flood took care of them, But when we think about the types of things that we're capable of now in terms of DNA manipulation, and you think about the incredible technology that Casey attributed to the Atlanteans, saying that they had the ability to dematerialize, that they used the two-eye crystal to run an entire society, including airplanes, boats, pleasure vehicles, and when you look at things like the Nazca lines and you see that we can read them, but we only knew that they were there because when we got flight, we could see them. You get the impression that early humanity had an advanced culture that had flight. I mean, it's just inevitable. So I think it does become, the echoes of those stories of giants become much more important, I think. And I think that the Atlanteans did have some very unusual physical characteristics. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay. L. Dillon.
Yes.
I heard some of the saucer craft the military study and try to reverse engineer are not from space, but from archaeological sites. Any comments?
Well, what's weird about that is I brought this up about Bob Lazar last week, which is that one of Balthazar's saying he was checking out the sport model was that it was from an archaeological dig. I found that amazing because all these years that I've listened to him talk about that, I never thought that that was the case. But it could be quite a revelation if they found an ancient crash saucer and reverse engineered that. I think it's quite remarkable. And I think that when we look at stories in the Bible, like Ezekiel's story, what we're looking at there is something like that. So we're getting an echo there. When they asked Casey about what type of flying ships that the Atlanteans had, he said, well, these were such as Ezekiel described at a much later date. So indicating that somebody was still operating those craft long after the Atlanteans. So it gets to be, when you start to get into those levels, wow, you're looking at a very interesting idea of what did they do with that technology? And that's where the mystery schools and the exteganography, I think, really come in terms of how do you hide that type of advanced stuff that humanity almost did themselves in with back in Atlantean times. Remember that story by Plato is he's retelling a story that the Egyptian priests had. So it's a historical piece. This idea that he made it up as a fable or because he was upset at Socrates' death doesn't wash. And so if we think of it historically, it makes a lot of sense. It's just that it's a chapter that's left out of our collective memory. Yes.
Philip Gillenwater just said, right. DJ is a machine. He keeps going and going and going. So true. All right, so Tricky Vicky wants to know, I've been looking for Carmen Bolter's Atlantis series. I watched the Pyramid Code yesterday. Is her Atlantis documentary available to watch? No? No. She's working on a series now called New Atlantis, and we will get a full update from her on this. I got a pretty good idea from her originally about what it was all about, and it sounds fantastic. There was a lot of emphasis also on sites in the Pacific as well. So she was really doing a worldwide thing with this. And we know just from what she did with the Pyramid Code that this is going to be absolutely fascinating. And I'm so looking forward to it. But remember this with Carmen, this is somebody who, again, can put in this type of exceptional effort and use intuitive abilities as well as scientific abilities to get to the answers. And she is starting from the vantage point that Atlantis did exist. This is crucial because she understands when you study the Egyptian history, they tell you they're a legacy culture and that this other culture was the one that gave them that legacy. So if you really take the Egyptians seriously, they're the ones who point out Atlantis. That's why when Plato gets the story and it's from a relative who said, I went to the priests in Egypt and they gave me the story, that makes sense to me because they were the ones who would have kept the histories. So I've always taken the Plato's version of Atlantis absolutely as, prose and not poetry. Yes. Carol Casa, whatever happened to Carmen's discovery of those hidden Egyptian artifacts in Turkey?
Well, there's a 3-part series we did with them here, and those are from 2017. And as I understood it, and we can see there's still wartime action now with Turkey, that they were close to a Turkish military site and they experienced all kinds of difficulties. Now, one of the other things that she talked about was this whole finding the tomb of Alexander. That's just something that she's been working on. And so this is really an incredible story. She was telling, the last time I spoke to her, she was telling me about the Ark of the Covenant and the activities around finding the Ark of the Covenant that she was involved in. So she's somebody who really works long and carefully and then comes out with it, because I think the Pyramid Code is maybe like 2010, something like that. Mm-hmm. So this is a long, this is going to be like a decade later where she comes out with this. And we're very excited to bring that interview to you, and we certainly will. As soon as I'm done, actually, I'm going to call her.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm glad you brought up the Ark of the Covenant. So Michael Lorette wants to know, was there a 2-eye stone in the Ark of the Covenant? Carol Casa actually answered that and said, I've studied its structure. It was a very large capacitor that could pick up charges from the air. What say you?
This is fascinating. It's weird. One of the things that Graham Hancock first studied was the Ark of the Covenant. That's when he was working as a reporter for The Economist. He was in Ethiopia, and he heard that they kept the Ark of the Covenant there. There's a whole tradition about it. And he became absolutely convinced based on his research there. The Ark of the Covenant is, it's been the spotlight of all these myths and mysteries, and Raiders of the Lost Ark and everything else. But fundamentally, it's it's again, that suggestion of a spiritual interface of high technology. But remember, when the wrong people get their hands on it in the Bible, all these people die from touching it and all the rest of it. So it's highly radioactive. They give a description of how it's made in there with cedar and gold and everything else. I think that, like the Two-Eyes Stone, the ideas of reconstructing it become something that when we apply modern scientific sensibilities, we start to understand how it works. But it has this metaphysical interface with it. And anyone who believes in the history of the Bible definitely believes that the Ark of the Covenant is a real thing. The idea that it would just disappear doesn't make sense. It seems like it's the kind of artifact that would be treasured and put somewhere. So I think this is an echo of Atlantean technology. Absolutely. Miss Olivia, we will take the last two questions. I want to remind everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X-Series episode 69, Egypt, Pharaohs and Mysteries in the Hotzone. We've gone deep in showing Bloomfield Moore's research and in East Florida, which showed demonstrations of the Two-Eyes Stone. We've seen these very unusual stories pop up about a Sphinx in the Hotzone, pyramids in the Hotzone. And then we have the verifiable story of Paulina Zelitsky and her ruins that she found off the western tip of Cuba. We know they're there. So there's no question about it. And she worked on them for a good long time under the auspices of the Cuban government. So what are we to conclude from all these ruins underground? We've got the mystery school story on top, and we have the geopolitical slice of people like Ernest Hemingway and Lindbergh and Casey and JFK all involved in this. It's inevitable that the story comes out, and this is, we're finding our way into it to find out what it means. And I think when you think about it, fundamentally start with this. Land rising. Think about that. What does land rising mean? So if land is rising off the east coast of America, that's the first step. The second step is the ruins are associated with Atlantis. That's crucial. The third step is that there's been a battle over those things, and it's been informed by mystery school activity and political forces, at least over the past 150 years. So I think that's really the key way to look at it. But we'll take the last two questions. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter and keep us in touch with each other. Don't let us lose that connection through social media, because I think the social media networks, they're here today, gone tomorrow. I do feel like...
Well, look at what they're doing in California.
It's true.
And getting away with it.
And I think that, certainly we'll utilize them in whatever form they morph into. And we're going to make sure. I've always said that if I had to, I'd broadcast on this phone right here, if I had to, certainly. But when it comes right down to it, it's a crucial thing to get on the newsletter. So go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for it, and we'll hit you up once a week on Friday and let you know what shows are coming up and who the very important guests are. You're going to want to be part of the Dark Journalist site for October, November, and December. We're going to close the year with a powerful set of documentaries and interviews, and of course, the exciting 5 episodes leading up to the 75th episode of the X series, which will be a setup that's a mind blower. If you've been following this information, get behind the show, subscribe to it, and we've made it very affordable for you. And so go to the site and make sure you get behind the work that we're doing here. We appreciate your support, and it makes all the difference to the amount of time and energy we put into this, which is quite a lot. But we appreciate it. And now we will take the last 2 questions of the night. Miss Olivia.
Channeling the heart, Barbara Joyce. Do you think CERN might be the current version of the two-eye stone, and could it go wrong for us?
Well, CERN is very dangerous. The first thing that we learned about CERN was that it had a $6 billion budget originally. Now it's $20 billion, which is immediately, it's not a scientific project. That's a sizable budget. That's a military style budget. And that's some of the interviews that I've done with Dr. Farrell about it. That's what we learned there. Second, though, we learn even through the CERN Tarot project that there's a lot of mysticism associated with what they're up to. And I do feel that we know that when people have studied it and scientists, ethical scientists have complained that it pulls on the magnetosphere when it's operated, that it has an environmental impact. And for a while, some of these scientists were saying that the strangelets that were involved with CERN would be like little black holes that could come out and suck up matter, and that this was a very kind of dangerous situation. When they went through a court in Hawaii to sue them. These were scientists who were in Hawaii, and they found out that CERN was a sovereign entity and really couldn't be sued, or it's going to be very difficult to do it. So the deeper you get into CERN, the more concerning it is, and I feel like we need more scrutiny on what they're up to. Absolutely. Its relation to the two-eye stone, boy, it really does sound like it.
Well, and if the two-eye stone is controlled by your state of consciousness, would you trust those people playing around with that kind of power and their intention and their own personal frequency? It's
true. Well, remember when CERN was first coming out, I mean, in CERN, we're talking about the Hadron Particle Collider at CERN, because CERN is the nuclear scientific agency that controls it, which has been around since 1959 and has such glorious people like Chase Manhattan's John J. McCloy signing off on it. But it has some very old Nazi ties to its original setup. I'm not saying that it's a Nazi organization now, but it's interesting to think of how it was founded in the 50s. Now, when we look at CERN and the Hadron Particle Collider, the original idea was we want to find the Higgs boson by smashing all these particles together to learn about the Big Bang, the so-called God particle. Well, in their own heads, they said that they have all done that, although some people dispute that. And so then they set up another one, which was called Alice, and had all these references to Alice in Wonderland. We've done a lot on Alice in Wonderland on this program, and how it's related to a larger occult understanding of forces in nature. So I do feel that when we're looking at the Hadron Particle Collider, we're looking at something which now openly they talk about trying to interact with other dimensions. 5 years ago, they would have said that was a joke, and people who brought it up were a joke. Just like the idea that they could produce a black hole that could be problematic environmentally would be a joke. But then now we know they've done tests. Certain scientists have done tests where the magnetosphere is directly impacted. So it is, I mean, it needs more oversight because of the dangers of what it is. And then again, what are they up to with it? If they already found the Higgs boson, they want to keep going. And now other countries are announcing, well, we're going to do our own particle colliders. Well, we've had them here in America before too, but there's something about CERN's Hadron Particle Collider that's sort of supercharged. And so I think there's a lot of unanswered questions about it.
It does seem, and people talk about this all the time, that the term death cult comes up a lot. And that what we're really looking at is different factions of a death cult, that these people are fascinated with destruction. They certainly are not fascinated by life.
No, I think that they certainly are reckless. And, you know, a lot of the people around CERN, the scientists, treat it like they're at the, you know, altar of the Pope, or something. Just like with the D-Wave chip. So there's a good way to move technology forward.
Well, there's a responsible way to do it.
An ethical form to do it. And then there's the Frankenstein. So you're always perched between those two. There's been a lot of Frankenstein activity around the transhumanist part. And you feel like eventually in the public's mind that's going to boomerang. But what a great question. We'll take the last question.
I saved this question for last because I love it. Steiner de God. Steiner said in the future, there would be a vaccine to rid humans of spirituality. Do you think this is happening now or down the road? If the latter, do you think it will be advertised as such?
It is absolutely fascinating. And Steiner did say this, and, he let out a few things about America in this period that we're in. He said that they would adopt legislation to outlaw thinking at some point. I think we're starting to see that. Look, Steiner's work and the great spiritual science work of anthroposophy is aimed at the 21st century. I have no question about it. I don't even know. I mean, it's kind of absurd to think about Steiner in his own time. He was talking in such a futuristic fashion and had a great grasp on geopolitical developments, on psychic developments, on the mystery school, which he was an initiate himself. So this thing that he said about vaccines, I feel, is a message that he was giving us. They are often the past about what was coming in the future. And he attributed a spiritual aspect to it. Now, I think that there's excessive vaccines in the marketplace today, and it's largely based on incredible profit and, damn the public as far as developing autism or these different things as a result of it. The idea of a deeper thing beyond just doing, a profit thing and polluting the public, I think it does come into play. And I think that it is something that Steiner suggested, that it's an intentional action by a group to create a new type of subservient human being who is not capable of thinking for themselves. I think there has to be some understanding, some aspect of that. But is it a way to dominate spirituality? When we look at groups like the Amish, are you going to take groups like the Amish who have a tradition? If you take New York as the example, when they suspended the religious exemption for Hasidic Jews, I mean, that is basically stripping them of their constitutional rights. We've seen it in California. It's already gone. California is kind of constitution free. And now New York. So I do feel like it's a major problem that Steiner was pointing out. And we do see incredible advocates like RFK Jr. moving against this through intense political pressure in the media. So it's going to be a battle, folks. There's no question about it.
Well, I don't know. I was just thinking about it. It's kind of, they've already done it because the vaccines have the metals that destroy our pineal gland, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. That's an excellent point.
And I have to say, I don't know how to do it, but I would like to decalcify my pineal gland, and I would like to invite everybody, in the ideas room, and all the listeners to join me. I think now is the time. We know
our friend from The Pursuit of Happiness did a video on that. I know Gigi's done one. So yes,
the time has come.
This is important anyway, but I think when you get right down to it, to be spiritually clear, to be spiritually coherent. Now, this is this show is about the journalism, the dark journalism around these things. So I'm not here for spiritual advice, as it were. But I think that there's no question in the type of challenging environment that we're in based on the culture as we're seeing, as it's rolling out up into 2020 here. It's not a healthy culture. And so therefore, keeping ourselves spiritually attuned and mentally with the right information, with the right types of sources of information. That's why I think it's so important to get behind things like this show and get behind the great work that's out there as we do, and really promote the good ideas for things like Solari or Forbidden Knowledge TV, whatever it happens to be, or Rudolf Steiner's ideas or Gurdjieff's ideas. I mean, these are things that we as a group can get our hands on and really move forward. And that's why things about land rising and Atlantis rising in the Hotzone, it's connected to that. It gives us something. It's a larger picture. It's not, oh, Nancy Pelosi or, Trump gets impeached or all this junk, which is 2 Minutes Hate from 1984 over and over and over again. And nobody wins in those battles. That's the nature of it. I mean, robust political dialogue, I'm all for, but this is like hypnotic fighting. So we have to be, I think, very careful in this process. And the best way to stay in touch and open up your pineal gland is meditation. There's no question about it. So, wow, fantastic. Miss Olivia, of course, taking it into the outer reaches. Nicely done.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. Yes.
Everybody was full of ideas and recommendations for other books and videos to look into, and we will be doing that.
Fantastic. I love it. Do you want to shout out some super chatters?
I do.
Yes.
So we have James Belch, Dark Warrior, Eric Ackerley, B. Brax, Charles Marlowe, Scabtree Scabby, Monica Jagley, Cragen Rock, Rick Time, and Amanda Bear. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Nicely done. We appreciate your support of the show. And for subscribers, thank you very much. It makes all the difference to the work that we do here. We'll be back at you next week. Of course, I'll be working to get Carmen Bolter on the show in the meantime. Carmen, I hope you had a great trip back. And we've got some great shows with Walter Bosley coming up. On NIMSA and Napoleon, and some of the new kind of space ventures that he's involved with.
Is Walter next week?
Well, he's coming up.
Okay.
He's coming up. Yeah, we're going to confirm. And I will also wanted to mention that one of the important stories that we've been following in relation to the Hotzone work has to do with someone who was associated with some of it, who got in touch with me that was related to one of the players that we talk about a lot in relation to the Hotzone. So we hope to bring you some of that information. And we look forward. That's the wonderful thing, really, when we put the information out there, is some of the feedback that we get, or people who are connected with these things. It's really fantastic. And you can always email us at info@darkjournalist.com. It's always confidential, and you don't have to tell us the whole story right there. We'll find ways and means to keep your story private until you're ready to come out with it. But we definitely appreciate that. It's been great having everyone here. I definitely love to shout out at the end, hey, Remedy Report. That's a great name. I don't know who you are, but that's a great one. And Scarlet Fire, Ting Ting, Philip Gillenwater. It's terrific to see you. Kontiki Man, William Kilmick. Excellent. I know we saw Kate out there earlier. It's great to see you.
Thomas Tyson.
And Tricky Vicky. Excellent questions tonight. Grandma Tippy Toes, as always, terrific to have you out there in the ideas room. Next week, we will be back at you with episode 70, and we're going deep, and it's going to be space related. That much I can tell you. And in the meantime, we'll be working with Dr. Bolter to get her back on the show. And Najat Madri, it's great to see you out there also. Johan, thank you very much. We will see you all next week.
Okay.
And so, Miss Olivia, your thought going into the weekend?
My deep thought. I don't know. I need to get to that gelato as quickly as possible.
Well, I almost said, what are you going to have? But gelato sounds good. And I think that's the real dynamic answer. So... And it's interesting, too, because I'll tell you, in Boston, it's very cold and rainy. So it wouldn't be normal.
We actually are known for eating more ice cream, especially in winter, than anywhere else.
Isn't that interesting?
Nothing stops us.
Indeed, it's fascinating. We will see you all next week, and thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
And, of course, it says end the broadcast, but as we know, the broadcast never ends.